He died at the wheel after 3 days without sleep. When he came to, he was on a hillside in a stranger's body with a goat chewing on his sleeve. For 20 years he had taught how to turn dead earth into living soil. Here people are sold for a sack of rice, and now he stands on a mountain of groundwater in the middle of a parched valley, watching as bound women are driven past. Among them is his sister. Her mouth is stuffed with dry clay, her tongue is swollen. Taemin rolls onto his side and spits a lump of brown mud onto the stiff, unfamiliar grass. Everything smells wrong. A goat tugs at his sleeve and stares at him with a yellow, indifferent eye. He raises his hand to push it away and freezes. The hand is not his own. Thin, dark from the sun, with calluses he's never had. And then a stranger's memory crashes over him like a bucket of ice water. His mother with her bad back, 2 sisters, goats on the hillside. A word he heard more often than his own name. Useless. He is Jeon Taemin, the youngest son, a shepherd, the one from whom nothing is expected. But beneath this layer lies another, the smell of the canal, headlights fading upward through the murky water, a dissertation on the restoration of saline soils, 6 years of field measurements, 20 years of life he lost by falling asleep at the wheel. 2 memories lie on top of each other, and he doesn't know which one is real, but the body decides for itself. He sits down. Down on the road, women walk in rows of 4. Their hands are bound with rope. Ahead, 2 men with spears. Behind, 1 on a horse, a caravan. And memory pushes the faces forward. Second from the left in the 3rd row, Sun Hee, his younger sister. She is 12. Behind her is her mother. Behind her mother is the blacksmith's widow, Kang Sol. Taemin stands on trembling legs. He takes a step down and freezes, because beneath his bare foot, the earth speaks. Not with sound, just that his foot feels something it hasn't felt before. Deep below, cold, alive, water. An aquifer 3 chalk deep, large, clear. There's enough water here for 10 wells, and not a single one has been dug. He stands on a mountain of water in the middle of a parched valley and looks down at the bound women. And he thinks a single cold thought. For 20 years he's been teaching how to make the dead earth alive, and here people are sold for a sack of rice. So he has a profession, and that means he has a job. He lets go of the goat and walks down to the road. His body is afraid. The shepherd's memory screams that the overseers beat them with sticks, but the agronomist's memory calculates. 3 guards, 26 women. There are no wells on the plot, so they carry water with them. So every hour in the sun costs them a sip. That is his leverage. At the fork in the road, he steps in front of the caravan and bows low like a youngest son. Then he straightens up. He says he knows these women. That one girl has sores on her lips and has a fever, and at the capital market they'll pay half price for her. The heavy, sweaty overseer stops. A water bag hangs from his belt, almost empty. He asks why the shepherd is meddling in matters not his own. Taemin replies that he wants a deal. Leave me 3, the mother, the sister, the widow Kang Sol, and in 7 days I'll give the village a well and a field that yields 3 times more in taxes than all 26 women are worth. The overseer laughs. How would a shepherd know where to find water? Taemin bends down. He takes a pinch of earth, rubs it between his fingers, sniffs it, puts it on his tongue, spits it out, and says calmly, like a man who has done this 1,000 times, "There is water beneath us here. 3 chalk down and 1 step to the left of that flat rock. Sandstone above the clay castle, clear and cold, enough for 100 years. And if I lied?" Taemin points to the rock. "If water doesn't flow from there in 7 days, cut my throat right here." The overseer stops laughing. He looks into the shepherd's face and sees something he didn't expect. Silence, confidence, the eyes of a man who has already died once. 3 women out of 26 aren't worth it. He nods, unties the hands of the mother, the sister, the widow. The mother looks at her son and doesn't recognize him. The face is the same. The eyes are different. Taemin leads them back to the stone. Soon he clings to the hem of his shirt and won't let go. He drops to his knees, presses his palms to the ground, listens. The water is closer than it seemed from above. 2.5 chalk. He draws a circle on the ground 3 palms wide. This is where the well will be. 3 days later, 4 men come to the rock, not because they believe, because the overseer left a man to watch, and the elders fear that the shepherd's throat will be slit and the village punished. Taemin shows them where to dig, straight down in a circle. At a depth of 1.5 chok, the shovel strikes rock. The men freeze. He climbs down into the pit. He taps the rock with his knuckles. It sounds hollow on the left. It rings on the right. Dig a hand's width to the right. They dig. The rock ends. Beneath it is wet sand. On the 5th day, murky water rises from the bottom. Don't touch it. Wait. On the 6th day, it rises and clears. On the 7th, it is clear and cold. Taemin drinks first, then his sister, then his mother, then the widow. The men stand silent around the well. One dips his hand into the water and holds it there for a long time. Then he raises his wet palm and gazes at it as if it were a miracle. There had been no clean water in the village of Tangok for 6 months. The children were sick, the livestock were dying, and now the useless youngest son has drawn water from a stone. In the evening, the elders arrive, 5 of them, old men, with faces like cracked earth. They bring the grandfather's staff, made of dark wood with a finial shaped like an open palm, the symbol of the home. It is given to the one who has proven he can feed the family. The eldest holds out the staff and says one word, home. Taemin takes it. The wood is warm and smooth. He bows. He turns to his mother. She is sitting by the hearth. The fire is burning for the first time in 4 days. There is rice in the pot. Not much, but it's hot. His mother looks at her son. She lowers her eyes and speaks so quietly that only he can hear. You are not my Taemin, but my Taemin brought you here, so eat. He sits down, takes a bowl. The rice is bland and watery, but hot, and he eats and thinks. 1 well, 3 names saved. That is not enough. There are 12 villages in the valley, thousands of people. All of them are hungry. All of them are selling their children for a sack of rice. And in a year, the collectors will come again, and again, until no one is left. He needs a field, seeds, a system, time he doesn't have. He finishes eating, sets down the bowl, steps out into the night. The moon illuminates the cracked fields and the dead channels. Beneath it all is water, cold, patient, waiting. The earth here isn't dead, it's just tired. Like a field that's been squeezed dry for 20 years straight. It needs to rest, to be watered, and then it will feed everyone. Tomorrow he'll start. Today he has water, 3 names, his grandfather's staff, and 20 years of knowledge from a world no one here has seen. The morning begins with pain in his knees. Taemin lies on a mat of rice straw and feels every bone in this body. Thin, undernourished, muscles as thin as twine. He is used to a body that ate 3 times a day and slept in a bed. This body ate once every 2 days and slept on the ground. He gets up. He drinks water from a clay bowl. The water is cold and clear, from his well, the only one in the village that hasn't dried up. It is quiet behind the hut's wall. His mother is sleeping. His sister's son He is sleeping. The widow Kang's soul is sleeping in the annex. His older sister Hannah is not asleep. She sits by the hearth and watches him. Her eyes are dark. Her face is stern. Her hands are scorched at the wrists from years of working by the fire. She asks where he is going before dawn. Taemin replies that he is going to look at the land. Hannah is silent. Then she says that a neighbor came yesterday and asked about the well. He wants Taemin to find water on his plot too. He promises half a sack of millet. Taemin nods. But first, he needs to figure something out. He steps out of the hut and walks up the slope, barefoot. That's important. His feet sense the earth better than any instrument. He walks slowly. He stops every 20 steps. He squats down. He picks up some soil. He rubs it between his fingers. He sniffs it. He tastes it with his tongue. This is clay, heavy, sour, dense as stone. Rice would suffocate in soil like this. 20 steps further, a different taste. Loam, lighter, with sand, with the smell of iron. Another 20 steps. Here, he stops. The ground beneath his feet is softer, darker, with a faint scent of humus. There used to be a field here, maybe 10 years ago, maybe 20. The topsoil has sunk 2 fingers deep, but it's still there. And beneath it, loam with good drainage. And somewhere to the left down the slope, There must be a spring. He senses it. He doesn't see it. He doesn't hear it. He feels it through the soles of his feet. The cold is coming from below and to the left. Taemin turns and walks to the left. After 40 steps, he finds what he was looking for. A wet rock at the base of a boulder. Moss on the rock. Green. Alive. In the middle of a dead, dry slope. Green moss on a wet rock. This is the source. Water seeps from a crack in the rock. Slowly. Drop by drop. But it's seeping. He presses his palm against the stone. The water is icy. Clear. This isn't a groundwater lens. It's an underground stream. It flows from the northern slope and hits a rocky ledge. The water is looking for a way out and finds it here, through the crack, drop by drop. If he widens the crack, if he digs a channel from it down the slope to that dark patch of humus, if he builds 3-stepped terraces horizontally, it will be a field, small, about 1.5 tan, but functional. He stands on the slope and sees everything, not with his eyes, with his mind. Horizontal terraces, clay ridges along the edges to keep the water from draining away, a channel from the spring to the upper terrace, overflow from the top to the middle and from the middle to the bottom, drainage from the bottom into the ravine, rice on the middle terrace, beans on the top, radishes on the bottom, a 3-year cycle. The first harvest in 120 days if planted now. In 120 days, 4 months, and there's nothing to eat right now. He walks back down to the hut. Hana stands at the entrance with her arms crossed. Behind her is his mother. Behind his mother is the widow Kang Sol. Everyone is looking at him. He says he's found a place for a field. Hana asks what they'll use to dig. They have 1 hoe with a broken handle and 1 knife. Taemin thinks. Then he goes to the neighbor, the one who wanted a well for half a sack of millet. The neighbor is old, hunchbacked, with 3 sons who look at Taemin from behind the fence as if he were a wild beast. Taemin says he'll find water on his land, but not for millet. For 10 days of work by 2 of his sons, with hoes. On the slope above the Chon family's hut. The neighbor haggles. He says he needs his sons for himself. Taemin replies that without water, the sons will work another winter and then be taken away by the recruiters. With water, they'll stay home. The neighbor is silent for a long time. Then he agrees. By evening, Taemin finds water on the neighbor's plot. 4 choked down, deeper than the rock, but there is water. He shows where to dig. The neighbor looks at him with new eyes. In the morning, 2 of his sons come to the slope with hoes. Taemin stands where he found the humus and marks out terraces with sticks stuck in the ground, horizontally, according to the water level in a hollowed-out log. This technique predates agronomy, older than engineering. As simple as the truth, water doesn't lie. It always shows the horizon. The neighbor's sons are digging. Taemin digs with them. His body is weak, but he forces it to work. By evening on the first day, the top terrace is dug out, 4 paces wide, 20 paces long, knee-deep, a clay ridge along the edge. Taemin scoops up a handful of the dug-up soil and crumbles it between his fingers. Good, alive. It smells the way soil should smell, where food will grow. On the 3rd day, another person joins them, a woman, a widow from the far end of the village. She silently takes a hoe and begins to dig. Taemin asks her name. Oh Jin-ae, he remembers it. In the evening, he takes a strip of birch bark and writes 4 names on it with charcoal. Mother, Sun Hee, Kang Sol, Oh Jin-ae. 4 names, 4 people for whom this land must bear fruit. He places the birch bark in a crack between the stones of the hut's wall. Hana sees it. She asks what it is. Taemin replies that it's a list. She asks a list of what? He says they are the names of the people for whom the field is growing. Hana looks at the birch bark, then at him. Then she says his name isn't there. Taemin replies that he doesn't need the field. He'll have food anyway. Hana snorts. She turns away. She walks over to the hearth. But an hour later, Taemin finds another name on the birch bark, written in crooked, large letters. Jung Taemin. Hana's handwriting. On the 5th day, 3 more people come to them. 2 men and a boy of about 14. They've seen the terraces growing on the hillside and want to know what they are. Taemin explains, simply, just as he used to explain to students during field work. The earth is tired. It has borne crops for 20 years straight and hasn't been given a chance to rest. If you plant rice in it right now, nothing will grow. But if you plant beans first, beans feed the earth. Their roots take from the air what the earth needs. After the beans, the earth will be ready for rice. The men listen. The boy listens. They don't understand, but they saw the well. They saw water come out of the rock. If this man says that beans nourish the earth, maybe that's how it is. On the 7th day, the channel from the spring to the upper terrace is ready. Taemin removes the stone that was blocking the crack in the rock. Water flows, slowly, in a thin stream, down the channel, downward, to the upper terrace, filling it, flowing over the clay embankment to the middle terrace, from the middle to the lower terrace. The whole system is working. No pumps, no pipes, no metal, just clay and a precise calculation of the angle. Taemin stands at the edge of the lower terrace and watches as the water fills the trough, murky at first, then clear. The widow Kung Sol stands nearby, silently. She looks at the water and her lips tremble. Taemin asks what's wrong. She replies that the last time she saw water in a rice paddy was 2 years ago, when her husband was alive. Taemin doesn't know what to say, so he just stands there. A minute later, she raises her hand and wipes her eyes with the back of her palm. Then she asks when to plant. Taemin replies that beans come first. In 2 months, harvest the beans and plant the rice. If everything goes according to plan, the first rice will be ready by fall. She nods. She turns and walks toward the hut. Her back is straight. Her step is firm. She knows what to do. She is the mistress of the house. All she needed was a field. At night, Taemin lies on a mat, unable to sleep. Her sister snores nearby. Her mother snores behind the wall. It is quiet in the annex. Kung Sol does not snore. He thinks about tomorrow. He needs bean seeds. He needs manure for mulch. He needs straw for a granary that does not yet exist. He needs to find a second water source further down the clip for the second phase of terraces. He needs to talk to the elders about a communal well for the lower houses. He needs to. He needs to. He needs to. The list is endless, and he has 2 months until planting season. His body is weak. There are few people. There are no tools. But there is water. There is land. There are names. 5 names on the birch bark. Tomorrow there will be 6. Taemin surveyed the slope and found an underground spring for the terraced field. He traded the search for a well for his neighbor in exchange for a helping hand, and in a week he built 3-step terraces with gravity-fed irrigation. He started keeping a list of names on birch bark, and so far there are 5 people on it. Bean seeds were found at an old woman's house on the far edge of the village. Her name was Pak Wolson, and she had kept a handful of dried beans in a clay pot under the floor for 3 years. She had saved them in case everything else ran out. Everything else ran out 2 years ago, but she still hadn't touched the pot. Taemin came to her with Hana. Hana spoke. Taemin was silent. Hana said that her brother had found water and was building a field, that the beans would return 3-fold, that the old woman would not lose but gain. Pak Wolson listened, then she looked at Taemin. She asked if it was true that he had drawn water from a rock. Taemin replied that the rock had nothing to do with it. The water was underground. He just knew where to dig. The old woman was silent for a long time. Then she pulled a pot from under the floor. The beans were small and dark. Some were cracked. Some had mold spots, maybe a quarter of the normal amount for one terrace. Taemin sorted them right on the floor. He set aside the cracked ones. He set aside the moldy ones. 2 handfuls remained. That wasn't enough for a full planting, but it would be enough for seedlings. He knew how to do it. Soak them for a day, germinate them in a damp cloth, plant the sprouts, roots down, in small holes on the upper terrace, each bean a palm's width from the next, no closer. The roots need space. Bean roots fix nitrogen. They take it straight from the air and feed the soil. 2 months after harvesting, the soil will be ready for rice. This is basic first-year agronomy, but no one here knows about it. He returned to the terraces and began to work. He soaked the beans in a bowl of spring water. His mother gave him a rag, a clean one, the last one. Taemin wrapped the damp beans and placed them in a warm spot by the wall of the hut. 2 days later, white sprouts pushed through the cloth, tiny, stubborn, alive. Sunhee saw them and smiled for the first time in a month. Her lips still ached, but the smile was genuine. Taemin planted the sprouts on the upper terrace, with his hands, one by one, each in its own hole. He poured water from a bucket into each hole. He worked on his knees for 6 hours. His back was on fire, his palms were rubbed raw. A shepherd's body wasn't used to such work. But the beans were in the ground. 47 sprouts, 47 chances. Now it was time to wait. While the seedlings took root, Taemin turned his attention to the second problem: manure. The fields needed organic matter. There were 7 goats and 2 oxen in the village. There was manure, but they dumped it in the ravine because it stank. Taemin gathered what he could find. He mixed it with last year's straw and river silt from the dried-up riverbed below the village. He put it in a pit at the lower terrace. He covered it with branches and weighed it down with stones. In a month, it will be compost. In 2 months, this compost can be used to fertilize the middle terrace for rice. Hana stood nearby and watched as he kneaded the manure with his hands. She said she never thought she'd see her brother up to his elbows in cow dung with such a happy face. Taemin replied that manure isn't dirt, but gold, that whoever understands this first will become richer than a prince. Hana rolled her eyes and went to translate for the neighbors who were standing on the path and watching. She told them that the scholar was asking them to gather all the manure and carry it to the pit by the terrace, and that for every bucket of manure, he would write their name down on a communal debt list. After the harvest, he would pay them back in rice. The neighbors exchanged glances. One laughed, another tapped his temple with his finger, but the third, the very same neighbor for whom Taemin had found water, he came in the evening with a bucket, and he brought not only manure, but also news. Word in the village is that the governor has sent new recruiters. They are going through the southern villages and taking all girls over 10. This year's tax arrears. In 2 weeks they'll reach Tangok. Taemin felt a chill inside. Soon he is 12. 2 weeks. He sat by the hearth and thought. The fire crackled. His mother slept. Soon he slept. Kang Sol sat in the annex mending clothes. Hana sat across from him and waited. She knew what he was thinking. She could see it in his face. Taemin said they needed to talk to the elders. Hana replied that the elders wouldn't listen. They had already given up 26 women without a fight. They would give up the rest, too. Taemin shook his head. The elders hadn't given them up. The elders had agreed because they thought it would be worse otherwise. If they showed them there was something to pay with besides people, they would agree to pay without people. Hana asked what to pay with. The beans hadn't grown. The rice hadn't been planted. There was no grain. Taemin thought. He had one resource: water. He could find water anywhere in the valley. The governor needed a tax payment. The tax could be paid with rice. There was no rice, but there was land that could produce rice, and there was water that could irrigate that land. If he could convince the tax collectors that in 3 months Angok will pay 4 times the standard tax in rice, if he showed them the well, the terraces, the water, proved that these weren't just empty words, the tax collectors weren't fools. They did the math too. 20 girls were worth a certain amount at the capital's market. A tax payment of 4 times that amount in rice was worth another. The tax collectors would choose the larger sum. It was simple math. Hana listened. Then she said he was crazy. Then she said she would go with him to the elders in the morning. In the morning they came to the house of the senior elder. The house was old, walls of clay and straw. The roof had sagged at the left corner. 5 old men sat around an empty hearth. Taemin bowed. He spoke. He spoke like a scholar defending his dissertation. Calmly, with facts, with calculations. He said he had found 3 aquifers within the village. He said he had built a terrace and would harvest the first crop in 3 months. He said he could dig 10 wells in 20 days if they provided the labor. He said the fields on the slopes could be terraced and would yield twice as much as the parched fields down below. He said that if the elders gave him 20 days and 20 workers, he would produce results he could show the tax collectors. The elders were silent. Then the eldest asked what would happen if it didn't work out. Taemin answered just as he had to the overseer. If it doesn't work out, let them hand him over to the collectors instead of the girls. Hana shuddered beside him, but she said nothing. The elders exchanged glances. They had already seen the well. They had seen the water. This man hadn't lied last time. Maybe he wasn't lying now either. And if it didn't work out, they would hand over 1 useless shepherd instead of 20 girls. The benefit was obvious. They agreed. By the evening of the next day, 20 workers had been found, 10 women and 10 teenagers. There were almost no men left in the village. They had been taken into the army or had died of starvation. Taemin lined them up on the slope by the second spring he'd found that morning. He showed them how to dig a trench. He showed them how to mix clay for the rollers. He showed them how to set up a level using a log and water. Kang Sol stood next to him and began assigning tasks. No one asked her to. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. Her voice is soft, but when she speaks, people listen, because she doesn't say a word too many. By the end of the second day, 2 new terraced plots had been marked out and half dug. By the end of the 5th day, 3 new wells were yielding water. Taemin walked through the village from spring to spring, listening to the earth. Every time he found water and the first murky trickle began to seep from the ground, people gathered around. Silently, they watched. One old woman fell to her knees and began to bow. Taemin lifted her by the hand and told her not to bow. This is no miracle. This is work. The water has always been here. It's just that no one knew where to dig. But he saw in their eyes what he had seen in the eyes of the widow Kang Sol by the terrace. They looked at the water as if it were something lost and returned, as if it were a dead person who had come back to life. By the 10th day, the village had 5 wells and 7 terraced plots on various slopes. The beans on the first terrace were as tall as a palm, green, strong. 43 out of 47 had survived. Taemin wrote in his birch bark journal every day. The height of the stalks, the color of the leaves, soil moisture. Kang Sol brought him food to the terrace, a bowl of millet porridge, covered with a cloth so it wouldn't get cold. She set it down silently and left. Hana said the widow was fussing over him like a child. Taemin didn't notice. He was thinking about the harvesters. Taemin found bean seeds and planted them on the terrace. He received word that in 2 weeks the harvesters would come for the girls. He convinced the elders to give him 20 days and some men. In 10 days, he built 5 wells and 7 terraced plots. Kang Sol became his unofficial right-hand woman in organizing the work. On the 12th day, So-rin arrived, small, quick, with weather-beaten cheeks and a bag slung over her shoulder from which bundles of dried herbs stuck out. She had come from the mountains over the pass. She was carrying ginseng to sell in the southern villages. But the southern villages stood empty, houses with doors wide open, cold hearths, dead fields. People had left or been taken away. So Rin turned toward Tangok because she saw smoke. Smoke above the village meant that someone was alive and cooking food. She entered the village around noon and stopped, because she saw something she hadn't expected. People, working. Women were digging a trench on the hillside. Teenagers were mixing clay. 2 boys were hauling stones for the well wall. And in the middle of it all stood a thin young man with a shepherd's staff in one hand and a strip of birch bark in the other. He was counting something aloud and pointing toward the slope. So-rin stepped closer and heard words she didn't understand. He was talking about the water-resistant layer, about the groundwater table, about soil acidity. The words were unfamiliar, but he spoke with a confidence that left no room for doubt. She asked the woman nearest to her who he was. The woman replied that it was Jun Taemin, the one who draws water from stone. So-rin looked at the terraces, at the green bean sprouts in the upper plot, at the water flowing through the channel, and she felt something strange, not surprise, recognition. She had known all her life that plants talk, that the earth has a mood, that certain herbs grow only near water and others only on dry clay. Her mother had given her this knowledge, a mountain woman, nameless, from a clan not spoken of in the valleys. So-rin knew the language of plants as one knows one's native tongue, without rules and without textbooks. And now, standing before her, was a man who spoke the same language, but in different words. She approached him and said that ginseng doesn't grow on the southern slopes. Taemin turned around. He looked at her, small, dirty, with a bag that smelled of bitter herbs, eyes lively and quick as a bird's. He replied that ginseng doesn't grow on the southern slopes because it needs shade and acidic soil with a high organic content. The northern slope, under the canopy of the forest, humidity no lower than 70%. So-rin stared at him. Then she said that he had just described to her what her mother had explained 5 years ago, using gestures and pointing at the trees with a stick. Only with words So-rin had never heard before. Taemin said that it was called ecology. So-rin repeated the word, ecology. She tried to taste it. Then she took a piece of charcoal out of her bag and wrote it on the wall of the nearest shed, and next to it she wrote another word, her own, in a mountain dialect that meant the same thing, a living connection. Taemin looked at the wall and for the first time since waking up in this body, smiled, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Sorin stayed, not because she had nowhere else to go, she had a place to go. The mountains were her home, and she could return any day. She stayed because, for the first time in her life, someone was talking about plants, not as useful things, but as living systems, as family, as something that deserves understanding, not just use. The first thing she did was examine Sunhee's lips, sores, dry, with a white coating. So Rin opened her bag and took out a bunch of dried herbs. She crushed them between her fingers. She mixed them with her saliva because there was no other liquid. She smeared the mixture over the girl's lips. Sunhee winced at the bitterness. So Rin said it would sting for 2 days and then go away. 2 days later, the sores had dried up. 5 days later, they were gone. Sunhee ate without pain for the first time in 3 weeks. The mother looked at So Rin and didn't know how to thank her. So Rin waved it off. She said it was just ordinary mountain mint and nothing special. But Taemin saw how she turned away after those words and ran her hand over her eyes. All her life, she had been considered unclean, a half-breed, the daughter of a mountain woman and an unknown father. In the villages, they wouldn't let her treat people. They'd take the herbs, but wouldn't let her near the sick. Because mountain blood brings a curse, that's what they said. But here was a child with sores on her lips, and a mother who gave her permission, and the sores went away. And no one said a word about a curse. So Rin began to work. She walked the slopes with Taemin and showed him plants that he knew by their Latin names and she by their mountain names. Horsetail means water is nearby. Sedge means water is very nearby. Red moss on a rock means iron in the soil. A white coating on clay means salt. Taemin called this bioindication. So Rin called it listening. They argued over the words, but agreed on the main point. The earth speaks. You just have to know how to listen. By the 14th day, Taemin knew the map of the aquifers throughout the valley, as if he had lived here for 20 years. So Rin led him along paths unknown even to the locals. She showed him 3 springs on the northern slope that could be channeled down to the villages below. She showed him a clearing in the mountain forest where wild beans grew, not cultivated ones, small, bitter, but alive, and in a quantity that solved the seed problem. Taemin gathered 4 sacks. He returned to the terraces and began sorting. The large ones separately, the small ones separately. Discard the spotted ones. So Rin sat next to him and sorted with him. She told him about her mother's mountain clan, about how they read the land by the smell of rain, about the stones that hum before an earthquake. Taemin listened and recognized in her words what textbooks called folk geology, empirical knowledge, accurate, tested by generations, just without formulas. That evening, he wrote the 6th name on the birch bark. So Rin. She saw it. She asked what it was. He explained. She was silent. Then she asked why her name was on the list. Taemin replied that the field grows for those whose names are on the birch bark. So Rin said she hadn't asked anyone to grow it for her. She feeds herself. Taemin nodded and said he knew, but her name would stay on the list anyway, because she had healed Sunhee, and because without her, he wouldn't have found the wild beans. So Rin remained silent. Then she stood up and walked off into the darkness. Hana said the herbalist was strange. Taemin replied that she wasn't strange, she just wasn't used to it. On the 15th day, the collectors arrived. 3 on horseback and 1 clerk on foot carrying a wooden tablet. Taemin stood by the well and waited. He knew they would come. He had been preparing. Behind him were 5 wells of clean water, 7 terraces of green beans, gutters through which water flowed, and 25 workers who no longer looked like they were dying. The senior tax collector dismounted. He surveyed the village. He saw greenery on the slopes. He raised an eyebrow. He had expected to see empty houses and submissive old men. He saw work. Taemin bowed. He spoke, just as he had spoken to the elders, calmly, with calculations. He said that Tangok would pay the tax in rice, in full, in 3 months, 3 times the quota. He showed the terraces, he showed the wells, he showed the bean sprouts. He explained that the beans would prepare the soil for the rice, that the rice would be planted a month after the beans were harvested, that the harvest would be 3 times greater because the land would rest and be nourished. The collector listened. Then he asked, "What if not?" Taemin replied the same as before. "If not, then take him, sell him. A man who finds water is worth more than 20 girls." The collector looked at him for a long time, then at the well, then at the terraces, then at the clerk. The scribe scribbled something on a tablet. The collector nodded. He turned his horse around and rode away, without the girls. In the evening, the village was silent. Not out of fear, out of unfamiliarity. For the first time, the collectors had left empty-handed. For the first time, they hadn't taken anyone. Taemin's mother sat by the hearth and wept, quietly, silently. Soon-hee sat beside her and held her hand. Hana stood in the doorway and watched her brother. He sat on a rock by the well and wrote something on birch bark. New names. 20 girls who weren't taken. 20 names he had asked their mothers for before sunset. The list grew. The herbalist Sorin came to the village and stayed to work with Taemin. She healed the sores on Soon-hee's lips and found wild beans to plant. On the 15th day, the tax collectors arrived, but Taemin convinced them to accept a deferment in exchange for triple the tax in rice 3 months later. Not a single girl was taken away. The beans on the upper terrace bloomed on the 40th day, small white flowers on slender stems. Taemin knelt and examined each bush. He counted the buds. He touched the leaves. He checked the undersides for pests. Sorin stood beside him and did the same. They worked in silence. They had long since learned to understand each other without words. When Taemin touched a leaf and frowned, Sorin was already pulling the right herb out of her bag. When Sorin sniffed the soil and shook her head, Taemin already knew the humidity had dropped. 2 people from different worlds speaking the same language. The beans looked good, 41 bushes out of 43. 2 had died from root rot. Taemin dug them up and examined the roots. The rot was coming from below. It was caused by standing water in the corner of the terrace where the clay ridge was too high. He cut the ridge down by an inch, and the problem was gone. A simple solution, obvious to an agronomist, impossible for a person who had never seen how drainage works. Further down the slope, 7 other terraces were green with young shoots of wild beans. Sorin had planted them a week ago. The wild varieties are smaller, but hardier. They'll survive the heat, they'll survive the wind. They'll yield fewer beans, but more green matter that can be plowed into the soil as fertilizer. Taemin explained this to the workers on the terraces. He said they would harvest half the beans for food and leave half in the ground. They'd break the stems, stomp them into the mud, and the earth will eat them and grow stronger. The women looked at him as if he were mad. Food into the mud, when the children are hungry. Taemin didn't argue. He demonstrated. He took a single bush, broke it, trampled it into the wet clay of the terrace with his foot. He said that in 20 days, the soil in that spot would be dark and soft. He asked them to remember. In 20 days, he would show the result. They didn't believe him, but they dug. Because the wells worked, because water flowed, because this man had never been wrong yet. On the 42nd day, what Taemin had been waiting for and fearing happened. At night he woke up from someone else's dream, not his own, not the agronomist's, a shepherd's dream. A boy of about 8 stands on a hillside, holding a white goat by the horns. The goat pulls him down. The boy laughs. His older brother is nearby, tall, strong. He hits the boy on the back of the head and says that if he lets go of the goat, he'll go to bed without dinner. The boy grips the horns tighter. The goat bleats. The sun is warm. The older brother walks down the path. The boy watches him go and thinks that when he grows up, he'll be just as strong. The dream ended. Taemin lay in the darkness with a wet face. The tears weren't his. The longing for his older brother wasn't his. The tenderness toward the white goat wasn't his. The former Taemin, the real one, the shepherd boy who lived in this body before him. He hadn't died. He was sleeping somewhere deep inside. And in his sleep, he remembered what the new Taemin didn't know. His brother, who had died during conscription. The goat that had died of starvation last winter. The path he used to run on as a child. Taemin sat down on the mat and pressed his palms to his face. His hands were trembling. He didn't know how to feel about this. He had taken over someone else's body, someone else's life, someone else's family, a mother who knows he isn't her son. And somewhere deep inside this body, a boy who loved the goat and his brother is sleeping. And that boy is having dreams. Behind the wall, his mother coughed and fell silent. Taemin stood up. He stepped out of the hut. The night was cold. The stars hung low. Barefoot on the cold ground, he walked to the terrace. He sat on the edge. He dipped his feet into the water, cold, alive. Beneath his feet, the earth hummed with a quiet, distant rumble. The water stirred in the depths. He felt its movement like a second heartbeat, and suddenly he understood. This sensitivity, it wasn't his, not the agronomist from Suwon's. The agronomist knew the theory, the formulas, the methods, but to feel the water through his feet, to hear the earth with his palms, that was the gift of the shepherd boy, an ancestral gift, sleeping in the Chan bloodline. It had slept for 3 generations, and it awoke when the agronomist's knowledge gave it a voice. Sensitivity without knowledge was blind. Knowledge without sensitivity was deaf. Together, they became what the village called a miracle, and what he called work. 2 in one body, not enemies, not parasite and host, something else. He sat on the terrace until dawn. He thought. When the sun touched the mountain peaks, he stood up and walked toward the hut. His mother was already awake. She stood in the doorway and looked at him. Taemin stopped in front of her. He said that during the night he had dreamed of his older brother and a white goat. His mother gasped. She covered her mouth with her hand. Then she said quietly that the white goat's name was Nudi, and that only her son knew that name. Taemin nodded. He said the boy hadn't left, that he was here, that he was asleep but having dreams, and that every time Taemin found water, it was the boy showing him the way. His mother was silent. Then she did something she hadn't done since the very first day. She hugged him, tightly, the way you hug your own. She smelled of smoke and rice porridge, and Taemin stood there, not moving, because his body remembered those arms. And the boy at the bottom of his memory smiled in his sleep. On the 45th day, Kang-sol came to him on the terrace, not with food, with a conversation. She sat down next to him on a rock and was silent for so long that he thought she had fallen asleep. Then she spoke. She said that her husband, too, knew how to find good clay for the forge. He could feel it with his hands. He knew where to dig. People considered it a skill. She considered it a gift. Taemin listened. She continued. She said that when they took her husband away, she decided it was all over. Home, life, meaning. She walked and ate and slept, but inside there was nothing. Empty like a well that had dried up. And then they tied her up and led her down the road, and she thought she didn't even deserve that, because who needs an empty woman? And then a shepherd appeared, useless, the youngest son, and he said he knew where the water was, and there was water. Kang-sol fell silent. Taemin waited. She said she didn't know why she was telling him this. She just wanted him to know that she wasn't empty anymore. Taemin nodded. He didn't know what to say. He was an agronomist, not a poet. So he said what he could, that he needed help with the granary, that the first bean harvest was coming soon and he had nowhere to store it, that he needed someone who could count the sacks and make sure none went missing, and that this person had to be someone he trusted. Kang-sol looked at him. Then she asked why her. Taemin replied that it was because she was the only one who brought him food every day and never once asked why. Kang-sol stood up. She brushed off her skirt. She said the granary would be ready by morning, and she left. By evening, she had gathered 4 women and began clearing a spot near the lower terrace. Taemin gave her a plan. A double bottom, a layer of gravel to keep out moisture, walls of interwoven branches coated with clay, a sloped roof to drain rainwater. Small, for 20 sacks. Tango's first granary. 3 days later, it was ready. Kang-sol stood at the entrance and looked inside. Empty, clean, smelling of fresh clay and straw. She ran her hand along the wall, then along the door frame. Then she turned to Taemin and said she needed a door, a real one, with a lock. Taemin nodded. She said something else, that she wanted her name on the door. Not the Chan name, not her husband's name, her name. Kang-sol. Taemin took a knife. He carved 3 characters on the doorframe. Kang, Sol, Barn. She stood there looking at the letters. Then she turned away and walked off quickly. Hana later said she saw the widow crying around the corner of the hut, quietly, so no one would hear. Taemin didn't ask why. He knew. For the first time in 2 years, this woman had something of her own, not given by her husband, not taken by the tax collectors, her own, with her name on the door. There are now 26 names on the birch bark in the hut's wall, 20 girls, 6 from her inner circle, and the beans are blooming on all 7 terraces, and water flows through the channels, and the boy at the bottom of her memory smiles in his sleep, and there are 50 days until harvest. On the 52nd day, the beans on the top terrace ripened, the pods had darkened and dried out. Taemin picked the first pod and opened it in his palm. 4 beans, firm, heavy. He squeezed one between his fingers, hard, ready. He held it to his nose. The smell was dry and slightly sweet, the smell of food. So Rin stood nearby and watched. Taemin handed her a pod. She weighed it in her palm and nodded. Good, larger than the wild ones. The terrace had done its job. They began harvesting the next morning. 20 women went out onto the slope before dawn. Taemin showed them how to pick the pods without damaging the stems. The stems are needed. They'll be broken and trampled into the ground, just as he promised. Half the harvest for the earth, half for the people. The women worked in silence. Their hands moved quickly. The pods fell into the woven baskets with a soft thud. By noon, the upper terrace had been harvested. Kang Sol counted. 3 baskets from the top one, 7 from the remaining 7 terraces, 10 baskets of beans. That's not much. For a large village, it would last 2 weeks. But this is the first harvest, the first in 2 years. Kang Sol carried the baskets to the granary and transferred the beans into sacks. 4 sacks. She wrote the date and the terrace number on each one. Taemin didn't ask her to. She did it on her own. Because she is the mistress of the granary, and her granary is kept in order. In the evening, Taemin went out onto the upper terrace. The beanstalks lay broken on the wet ground. He stood at the edge of the terrace and began to trample them with his feet, slowly, methodically. The green mass sank into the mud. So Rin worked beside him. They covered the entire terrace in an hour. Then they watered it from the ditch. Taemin crouched down and scooped up a handful of soil. He sniffed it, put it on his tongue. The soil was changing. He could feel it. The acidity was dropping. The organic matter was rising. In 20 days, they would be able to plant rice here, if they had seeds. They had no rice seeds. The village had eaten the seed stock back in the winter. It was the same story in the neighboring villages. In the entire Tangok Valley, not a single sack of rice grains suitable for sowing remained. Taemin thought about this every evening. So Rin knew the mountains better than anyone in the valley. She said she'd seen wild rice on a marshy terrace 2 days' walk to the north, beyond the pass. Wild rice is small and bitter, but it's rice, and it can be sown. And after 3 generations of selection, something decent can be made of it. 3 generations, 3 seasons, a year and a half. Taemin didn't have a year and a half. He had 90 days. In 90 days, the tax collectors would return for the promised tribute, tripled, in rice. If there is no rice, they will take people, and his throat to boot. He sat by the hearth and drew on the ground with a stick. Numbers, calculations, the area of the terraces, the yield of wild rice, losses during threshing. It didn't add up. Wild rice won't yield the required amount in a single season. Even if all 7 terraces were planted, even if every grain sprouted, he needed cultivated rice, normal rice, with long grains and high yields, and he knew where to get it. In the capital, in the royal granaries. That's where the seed reserve was kept in case of disasters. A 3-day journey, through the territory of Governor Ondushik, past his outposts, past his tax collectors. Madness. Hana said he had gone mad. Taemin replied that he hadn't, that he wouldn't go to the king, that he would go to the merchants. At the market on the outskirts of the capital, they trade grain, and among that grain is seed rice. Expensive, very expensive, but it can be bought. Hana asked what for. They didn't have a single coin. Taemin looked at Sorin. Sorin understood. Ginseng, mountain ginseng, the very same kind she had been carrying to sell in the southern villages when she first came to Tangok. The dried roots had been lying in her bag for 2 months already. Sorin took out a bundle, 5 roots, 3 small ones, 2 large ones. The large ones were 10 years old. That's a fortune. In the capital, they'd give a sack of silver for a single root like that. And with a sack of silver, you could buy enough seed rice to feed an entire valley. Sorin placed the roots on the table and said that if Taemin was going to the capital, she was going with him. Because he wouldn't be able to tell good seed rice from rotten rice, and because she knew a shorter route through the mountain passes. 3 days could be cut to a day and a half if they went through the northern ridge. Taemin agreed. Hana said they were both crazy. Then she went to gather food for their journey. Kang Sol stood by the door and said nothing. When Hana came out, she approached Taemin and said one thing: to come back. Not for the valley's sake, not for the harvest, because her name was written on the barn door, and if he didn't return, that name would become an empty sound. Taemin looked at her. He nodded. They set out at dawn, Taemin and Sorin, with a sack of food and 5 ginseng roots. The trail led upward, steeply. Stones crumbled beneath their feet. Sorin walked ahead, moving like a mountain cat. Light, quick, without a single wasted step. Taemin gasped for breath on every ascent. His body was resilient, but his lungs were weak from malnutrition. Sorin stopped and waited for him, without reproach, without impatience. She simply waited, and while she waited, she gathered herbs along the trail's edges. At the pass, they stopped, and Taemin looked back. The Tangok Valley lay below, small, green with patches of terraces on the brown slopes, 5 dots of wells, thin threads of irrigation ditches, smoke from the huts, alive. He stood and looked and felt the earth beneath his feet reaching out to him, warm, familiar, as if the valley didn't want to let him go. Sorin touched his shoulder, and they moved on. The descent on the northern side of the ridge was steeper and more dangerous. The trail wound between the rocks, wet moss on the stones. Sorin walked with confidence. She knew every stone, every turn. By evening, they had descended into a wooded valley beyond the ridge. It was cooler here, greener. The trees stood thickly, and the air smelled of moisture and pine needles. They spent the night under a rock overhang. Sorin built a fire from dry branches, small, almost smokeless. She warmed up some bean porridge. They ate in silence. Then Sorin spoke. She said that in the mountain dialect there is a word for a person who has come from another place, not a stranger, not an enemy, but one whom the earth has called. She asked if this land had called him. Taemin chewed his porridge and thought. Then he replied that he didn't know, that he had woken up in a strange body on a hillside, that he remembered another life, another world, that there were machines there that ran without horses and light that burned without fire. Sorin listened. She didn't laugh. She wasn't scared. She listened just as she had listened when he spoke of soil acidity, with interest, seriously. Then she said that her mother had told her about people from that side of the sky, that they come when the earth is sick and cannot heal itself, that the earth calls them just as a sick person calls a doctor. Taemin thought it was a beautiful explanation, not scientific, but beautiful, and perhaps closer to the truth than anything he could have come up with himself. Sorin wrote another word in charcoal on a stone near their shelter, in the mountain dialect. Taemin asked what it meant. She said it meant, the one we've been waiting for. They set out before dawn the next morning, and by noon on the second day saw the walls of the capital. The beans had ripened and been harvested. Taemin realized that the wild rice wouldn't be enough for the promised tribute and decided to go to the capital for seed rice. Sorin offered her ginseng as payment and went with him over the mountain pass. In a day and a half they reached the capital. The capital of Haedong smelled different from the valley, of smoke and sweat and sour rice mash. The walls were made of mud bricks 3 men high. 2 guards stood at the gate with spears and bored expressions. Sorin pulled a rag over her head to hide her mountain features. Half-breeds are recognized by their cheekbones. Taemin walked through the gate without looking back. A shepherd from the hungry valley. There are thousands like him here. No one looks. The market in the suburbs turned out to be large. Long rows of straw awnings, the smell of spices and fried oil. Sacks of grain stood in pyramids at every third stall. Taemin walked along the row and looked. Rice, millet, barley, beans. Everything is here. Everything is expensive. He stopped at a stall where the sacks were marked with red stripes. Seed rice, select, long grain. He asked a merchant for a handful. The merchant looked at his clothes and smirked, but gave him a handful. Taemin poured the grains into his palm. He ran his fingers through them. He sniffed them. He put one on his tongue. He spat it out. No, damp grain, stored in a damp place. The germination rate will be less than half. The merchant frowned. Taemin didn't argue. He walked on. The second stall, the third, the fourth. The grain was mediocre everywhere, stale, damp, or infected with a fungus that Taemin could identify by the smell from 2 paces away. The capital was starving too. The good grain went to the palace. What was left ended up at the market. So Rin walked beside him and said nothing. She saw the look on his face. At the 7th stall, Taemin stopped. The sacks here were arranged differently. Not in a pyramid, in a row, under a canopy, on wooden pallets. The stall owner was an old man with a gray beard and a sharp gaze. He watched as Taemin walked along the row and felt the sacks through the cloth. Taemin stopped at the 3rd sack. He asked for a handful.
The old man gave it to him.
Taemin poured the grains into his palm and froze. Clean, dry, even. No spots, no smell of mold. He put one on his tongue. Firm, with a slight sweetness. Good, very good. He asked where the grain came from. The old man replied that it was from the southern fields across the river, the last harvest before the drought. He had stored it himself. Taemin asked the price. The old man named a figure that made So-rin sigh quietly behind him. 2 bags of silver for 1 bag of seeds. A royal price, because there are no seeds anywhere else. Taemin turned to So-rin. She untied the bundle and placed 2 ginseng roots on the counter, large ones. The old man took one. He turned it over, sniffed it, scraped the edge with his fingernail. His expression changed. He realized what it was. Mountain ginseng, 10 years old, wild grown, not cultivated. In the capital, they'd give not 2 but 5 bags of silver for a single root like this. The old man looked at Taemin, then at So-rin. Then he said he would give 4 sacks of seed rice for 2 such roots. Taemin shook his head. 6 sacks, and a separate sack of radish seeds. The old man haggled. Taemin wouldn't back down. He spoke calmly and mentioned things a merchant wasn't supposed to know. He named the exact variety of rice based on the shape of the grain. He named the growing region based on the color of the husk. He named the harvest year based on the density of the endosperm. The old man listened and looked at him more and more intently. Then he asked who he was. Taemin replied that he was a shepherd from Tangok. The old man didn't believe him, but didn't argue. He agreed to 6 sacks of rice and a sack of radishes for 2 roots. So-rin handed over the roots. The old man counted the sacks. 7 sacks. So-rin picked one up and groaned. Heavy, 30 kyun each. Taemin slung 2 onto his back. So-rin took 2. 3 remained. Carrying 7 sacks between the 2 of them over the mountain pass was impossible, Taemin thought. So-rin thought. Then she said she knew a man, a porter from the mountain clan. He lives by the southern gate. For a sack of beans he'll carry anything, anywhere. They didn't have any beans, but Taemin took a strip of birch bark from his belt and wrote an IOU on it, a sack of beans after the harvest, with a name and a seal. So Rin looked at him and said he didn't have a seal. Taemin pressed his thumb against the birch bark, a fingerprint, smudged with dirt and sweat. So Rin smiled and went to look for the porter. She found one. His name was Tak, a huge, silent man with shoulders wider than a doorway. He looked at the IOU. He looked at So Rin. She said something to him in the mountain dialect, quickly, quietly. Tak nodded. He took 3 sacks, 1 on each shoulder and 1 on his head. He set off. They left the capital before sunset. Taemin walked last. His back burned from the weight of the sacks. His legs buckled, but he kept walking. Because on his back were 6 sacks of seed rice. 6 sacks of the future. For every grain in these sacks, there would be 10 grains of the harvest. For every 10 grains of the harvest, 1 bowl of porridge. For every bowl of porridge, 1 name. The math was simple. They walked all. With Rin in front, carrying a torch made from a resinous branch. Tak behind her. Taemin bringing up the rear. At the pass, he stopped and looked down. The Tangok Valley lay asleep in the darkness. Not a single light. Only the stars were reflected in the water of the terraces, small squares of light on the black slope. His terraces, his water, his people. He turned and went down. By dawn they were home. Hana was standing by the hut. She hadn't slept all night. She saw the sacks and opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Then she said the food was on the hearth. Taemin set the sacks by the granary. Kang Sol came out of the outbuilding. She saw the sacks. She counted them. 7. She looked at Taemin. He said 6 were rice and 1 was radish. Seeds, not for eating. She nodded. She opened the granary. She carried the sacks in one by one. She lined them up on a tray made of branches. She wrote on each one, rice, seeds, do not touch, and the date. Taemin watched and thought that this woman was worth an army. Tok stood by the gate and waited. Sorin approached him and said something again in the mountain dialect. Tok looked at the valley, at the terraces, at the wells. He nodded. He left. Taemin asked Sorin what she had said to him. Sorin replied that she had told him to come in the fall for his sack of beans, and that this was a good place. Taemin asked if he would return. Sorin said that mountain people go where they are expected, and now they were waiting for him in Pangok, because his name was on the birch bark. Taemin didn't remember writing Tok's name. He looked at Sorin. She looked away. He unfolded the birch bark. At the bottom of the list, in a different handwriting, small and angular, Tok. Sorin had written his name while they were crossing the pass. Taemin and Sorin reached the capital and traded 2 mountain ginseng roots for 6 sacks of seed rice and a sack of radish seeds. With the help of the mountain porter Tok, they carried the seeds back to Tangok. Sorin secretly wrote Tok's name on the birch bark list. Sowing began on the 60th day. Taemin soaked the seeds in water for 2 days. He changed the water every 6 hours. He kept an eye on the temperature. Sorin added a decoction of mountain herbs to the water. She said her mother used to do that and the grains would sprout faster. Taemin didn't argue. Empirical knowledge. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, but it wouldn't make things worse. By the 3rd morning, the seeds had swollen and white sprouts had emerged from their shells. Taemin spread them out on damp straw in the shade of the barn. 2 days later, the sprouts had grown to half a finger's length. It was time. The upper terrace was waiting. The soil, after the beans, had become dark and loose. Taemin squeezed a handful, and it crumbled between his fingers just as living, fertile soil should. No clumps, no crust, with a faint scent of humus. 20 days ago, there had been dead clay here. Now the earth was breathing. He flooded the terrace with water up to his ankles. The murky water had settled overnight and become clear. The day later group came out to plant. Taemin showed them how, 1 sprout at a time, in a hole 2 fingers deep, a palm's width between holes, in even rows. The women stood knee-deep in water and watched. The mother was the first to step onto the terrace. Behind her, Kang Sol. Behind her, Sorin. Behind them, the rest. 20 women in a row, bowed backs, hands in the water, seedling by seedling into the wet earth. Taemin worked nearby. By noon, the upper terrace was planted. 500 seedlings, straight rows. The water glistened in the sun between the green dots. Taemin stood at the edge and watched. 500 rice seedlings. Each one would produce an ear. In 90 days will yield a spike. Each spike will yield 60 grains. 500 times 60 is 30,000 grains from a single terrace. From 7 terraces, 210,000. That will be enough, just enough, if nothing goes wrong, if there are no frosts, if no disease strikes, if the water doesn't run out, a lot of ifs. He began sowing the remaining terraces. They worked for 6 days, all 7 terraces, 4,000 seedlings. Kang Sol kept track. Each terrace is numbered. The number of seedlings was recorded. The planting date was recorded. She started a separate birch bark roll for this, a thick one, rolled into a tube. She kept it in the barn next to the sacks. Taemin told her that she was keeping the first set of accounts in the history of Tangok. Kang Sol asked what accounts were. He replied that it was when every sack was counted. She said that wasn't bookkeeping, but common sense. On the 65th day, a man whom Taemin didn't know came to the terraces, an old man from another village. The village was called Kamsan and lay a 3-hour walk south down the valley. The old man was thin as a stick, with sunken eyes. He said he had heard about the wells and the fields on the slopes. He said that in Kamsan, the wells had dried up a month ago. People were drinking from a puddle that would soon dry up too. The children were sick. 2 had died last week. He had come to ask for water. Taemin listened. Then he asked how many people were in Kamsan. The old man replied that there were 63. There used to be 140. The rest had left or been taken away. Taemin looked at Sorin, then at Kang Sol, then at Hana. Hana shook her head. She understood what he was thinking. They barely have enough for themselves. There is water, but not enough hands to work. The terraces are planted. 2.5 months until harvest. Going to Kamsan for 3 hours means losing a day. Finding water meant another 3 days at the well. 3 days they didn't have. Taemin thought. The boy at the bottom of his memory stirred, quietly, like a fish in the depths, and Taemin felt something he hadn't felt before, warmth in his feet, light, calling. The earth was pulling him south, toward Kamsan. He looked at the old man and asked for the names, all 63 of them. The old man began to list them. Taemin listened and wrote them down on birch bark, every name, every syllable. The old man spoke slowly and sometimes stumbled. He forgot. He remembered 63 names. When the last one was written down, Taemin rolled up the birch bark and said he would come to Kamsan tomorrow morning. Hana closed her eyes. Sorin nodded. Kang-sol silently went to pack him a meal for the journey. In the morning, he left. With Sorin, she knew mountain herbs for fever. If there were sick children in Kamsan, she would have work there. They walked for 3 hours along a dry stream bed. Kamsan turned out to be even worse than the old man had described. Huts with collapsed roofs, empty livestock pens. People sat in the shade of the walls and did not move. They were conserving their slows. Children lay on mats with their eyes closed. Sorin examined the sick. 4 had fevers. 2 had sores on their feet from dirty water. She began to work. She laid out the herbs. She crushed them. She mixed them. She gave them decoctions to drink. She treated the sores. Taemin took off his shoes and walked barefoot through the village. He listened to the earth. It was harder here. Kamsan stood on a clay ledge. The water had receded deep underground. He walked for an hour, 2, 3. The earth was silent. He widened his search. He went beyond the village. He walked down the slope toward the west. And at the western edge of the village, at the base of a rocky outcrop, he sensed it. Faint, distant, but it was there. Water at a depth of 7 chok. Deep. A week's digging. But there is water. He returned to the village, gathered those who could stand, 9 people, 4 men and 5 women, showed them where to dig, explained how, vertically, in a circle, reinforce the walls with stones. When the wet clay starts to come out, widen the bottom. He left So-rin with the sick and went back to Tangok. By evening he was home. He collapsed onto the mat and slept until morning. Hana didn't wake him. The next morning a messenger arrived from Kamsan. A boy of about 10, out of breath. He said they were digging. 2 chok had passed. The clay was dry. No water. The men were getting nervous. Taemin told them to keep digging. On the 3rd day, a second messenger arrived. 4 chok. The clay was damp. The men didn't believe there would be water. 2 of them stopped digging. Taemin sent a single word back with the messenger. Dig. On the 5th day, So-rin arrived, alone, on foot. Her eyes red from lack of sleep. She said that at a depth of 6 chok there was wet sand. At a depth of 7, water, murky, dirty, but water. By evening, it would settle. Taemin sat on a rock by the hut and closed his eyes. Kang-sol brought him a bowl of porridge, covered with a cloth. He ate and felt the warmth spreading from his stomach to his toes. There are now 89 names on the birch bark, 26 from Tangok, 63 from Kamsan, 2 villages, 1 list, 1 valley. On the 70th day, the rice on the upper terrace had grown to the height of 2 palms, green, thick, even. Taemin walked along the rows every morning and checked each plant. The leaves were healthy, the stems were strong, the roots held the soil. The water in the terrace was at the right level, 3 fingers above the ground, no more, no less. He adjusted the level every day. He trimmed the clay ridge if the water rose. He added clay if it fell. Simple work, monotonous, necessary. So-rin kept an eye out for pests. She found caterpillars on the 3rd terrace, tiny ones, green, almost invisible on the leaves. She picked each one off by hand, 312 of them in a day. Taemin suggested another method, ducks. Ducks eat caterpillars, and larvae, and slugs, and they don't touch the rice. So Rin asked where to get the ducks. Taemin didn't know, but he knew there were wild ducks on the marshy lakes to the east. Catching them was pointless, but they could be lured, with grain. He scattered a handful of millet across the lower terrace. By evening, 3 ducks had landed on the water. By morning, there were 7. A week later, 12. The ducks walked across the terraces and ate everything that crawled. They didn't touch the rice. The women watched the ducks and laughed. For the first time in a long while, there was laughter in the village. Taemin stood at the edge of the terrace and watched as a duck dove headfirst into the water after a caterpillar. Thinking that the ecosystem works even here, even in this world, because the laws of nature are the same everywhere. On the 73rd day, people came from the south, not from Kamsan, from far away, a family of 16, the last survivors from the village beyond the 2 mountain ranges. They had been walking for a week. 3 children could not stand. They were carried in people's arms. The oldest woman in the group approached Taemin and fell to her knees. She said she had heard of a man who draws water from stone, that they had nowhere else to go, that if he wouldn't take them in, they would lie down here and die because they had no strength left to go on. Taemin looked at the 16 people, emaciated, dirty, with eyes in which fear and exhaustion had blended into one, 3 children in their arms, one an infant. He looked at Hana. Hana was silent. He looked at Kang Sol. Kang Sol was counting in her head, grains running low. The beans were almost gone. The rice wasn't ripe yet. 16 mouths meant 12 days' worth of food. 12 days they didn't have. The elders stood to the side, silent. They were thinking the same thing as Kang Sol, that there wouldn't be enough food, that they had nothing to feed their own, that strangers were a burden. Taemin went out to meet the visitors. He stood before the eldest woman. He bowed, not to her, to the ground. He knelt down and pressed his palms against the dry earth, and he asked aloud for their names, each of the 16. The woman looked up at him from her knees and named them, slowly, name by name. Taemin wrote them down on birch bark. 16 names. When the last one was written down, he stood up. He turned to his people, to the elders, to Hana, to Kang Sol. He said they now had 16 more names, which meant 16 more mouths to feed. Hana opened her mouth, closed it. Kang Sol looked at him for a long time. Then she nodded and went to the granary. The elders were silent. That night, Taemin couldn't sleep. He lay there thinking about what he had promised. There was no food. Where would it come from? 16 people. What would he feed them? He got up and went out into the night. He walked toward the terraces, barefoot along the wet path. The moon illuminated the water in the ditches. The rice stood in neat rows, green, quiet. Taemin stepped to the edge of the lower terrace and froze. The earth hummed beneath his feet. Not like usual, stronger, deeper. Warmth rose from beneath the ground and traveled through his soles, up his legs to his stomach, to his chest, to his throat. He dropped to his knees. He pressed his palms against the wet earth of the terrace, and he felt the rice beneath his hands begin to grow. Not quickly, not right before his eyes, but faster than it should. The stalk stretched, the leaves unfurled, the ears swelled. He felt every root, every stalk, every grain, and the earth beneath him was hot, alive, the blood of the earth, the gift of the boy, the shepherds. Awakened by the fact that the agronomist had written down 16 new names, 16 reasons, 16 specific people for whom this field must yield a harvest, he knelt there until dawn. When the sun rose over the ridge, So-rin came to the terrace for her morning inspection and stopped. The rice on the lower was a full palm's width taller than yesterday. Ears of rice that hadn't been there the night before were poking out from behind the leaves. Heavy, full, impossible. Winter rice, in early summer, on a terrace that wasn't supposed to yield a harvest for another 2 months. So-rin stepped closer. She plucked a single ear, unfolded it, grains inside, white, solid, ripe. She looked at Taemin, who was sitting on the edge of the terrace, soaked from head to toe, and with mud on his face. He said he didn't understand it himself. She replied that she did, that her mother had told her about it, that the earth feeds those who feed by name, that this was ancient knowledge, older than the mountains. Taemin didn't argue. He couldn't, because in the lower terrace stood a harvest that shouldn't have been there, and this harvest was enough for exactly 16 people. Exactly. As if the earth had counted along with him. In the morning, Kang Sol gathered the ears of grain from the lower terrace. She threshed them, sifted them. 2 sacks of rice, white, pure. She carried them to the granary and wrote on each one, "Winter rice, lower terrace," for the newcomers. 16 people ate boiled rice that day, hot, white. The children ate and cried because their mouths were unaccustomed to food and ached. The mother of an infant ate and fed her baby at the same time. Tears streamed down her cheeks and dripped into the bowl. Hana stood by the hearth and served, ladle after ladle, silently, with a face that expressed nothing, but her hands were trembling. After the meal, the oldest woman among the visitors approached Taemin. She said that in her village there was a custom. When someone saved your life, you had to remember their face and tell your children, so that the children would remember, and their children's children. Taemin replied that there was no need to remember his face. You must remember the field, because the field feeds them, not him. She nodded, but she remembered his face anyway. From that day on, a new word appeared in Tangok. When strangers came and asked if they could stay, they were told, "Say your name. If your name is written on the birch bark, then there is rice for you." From that day on, there was no such thing as a superfluous person in Tangok. There was only a new name. On the 80th day, a woman with a sword entered the Tangok Valley, tall, slender, with a scar across her left eyebrow. Her left hand was pressed against her right shoulder. Her shoulder was wrapped in a brown rag stained with dried blood. She was walking along the road from the southern pass, moving unevenly. A step, a pause, a step, a pause, like a person counting their steps because they know there are few left. Sun-hee was the first to notice her. She was running from the well with a bucket of water when she saw a shadow on the road. She dropped the bucket and ran toward the Chan family's hut. Taemin stepped out onto the road. The woman stopped 10 paces away from him. She looked at him. Her eyes were feverish. Her face was gray. Her lips were dry. She asked if there was water in this village. Taemin pointed to the well. The woman walked over to it. She lowered the bucket with one hand. She lifted it. She drank for a long time. Water ran down her chin and neck. Then she straightened up and looked at Taemin. She said her name was Choi Ara, that she was a swordswoman. She had been in the retinue of the southern prince, Nakdon. The retinue was disbanded when the prince could no longer afford to pay them. 20 female swordswomen went their separate ways. Ada headed north. On the way, she encountered 3 men with knives. They wanted her sword. She killed 2 of them. The third stabbed her in the shoulder with a spear and ran away. That was 4 days ago. She'd been walking ever since, without food, with a spear wound that was festering. Taemin listened. Then he called for Sodin. Sodin came with a bag and got to work. She untied the rag on her shoulder. The wound was bad, deep, with ragged edges. The pus was yellow-green. The smell was sour. Sodrin washed the wound with water from the well. She applied a poultice made of crushed mountain mint leaves and some root whose name Taemin didn't know. She wrapped it with clean cloth. She said the fever would go away in 2 days. If it didn't, then it would need to be cut open. Cheara sat on a rock by the well and didn't move while Sodin worked. She didn't flinch once. She never winced. Taemin looked at her and saw a person who was as accustomed to pain as she was to the weather. Kang Sol brought a bowl of porridge. Ada took it. She ate with her left hand, slowly, carefully, like someone who knows that at any moment she might need to stand up and grab a sword, even while eating. The fever after 3 days. Sodin changed the poultice every morning and every evening. On the 4th day, Ada got up. She left the outbuilding where she had been lying. She walked through the village. She looked at the terraces, at the wells, at the women working on the hillside. She returned to Taemin and said that the village had no defenses, no walls, no guards, no weapons. Taemin replied that he knew. Ada said that sooner or later someone would come and take everything. The harvest, the water, the people. That's how the world works. Those who have, take. Those who don't, protect what's left. Taemin listened. He had been thinking about this since day 1. Slave traders, the governor, tax collectors, they'll all come, and he has nothing but wells and terraces and a list of names on birch bark. He asked Arda what she suggested. She suggested teaching. Taemin didn't understand. She explained, there are few men in the valley, but there are many women. Women who dig terraces and haul stones and knead clay. They have strong arms, strong backs. They lack only one thing, the knowledge of how to turn a hoe into a weapon. Ara can provide that knowledge, if they let her stay, Taemin thought. Then he asked why she should stay. She could move on, find a new master, join another band. Ara didn't answer right away. She looked at the terraces, at the green rice standing in the water, at the women working on the slope. She said that in 12 years of service, she had seen things built and destroyed, fortresses built, villages destroyed, armies built, families, and not once in 12 years had she seen anyone build a field. Because fields aren't built, fields are taken from those who have already built them. But here, a shepherd builds fields, and that is the only thing worth watching. Taemin listened, then he took a piece of birch bark and wrote down the name, Chue Ada. She looked at her name on the list. She said nothing, but the next morning, 12 young women from the village stood in the clearing below the lower terraces, sticks in hand. Ada stood before them, upright, with a sword at her belt, her arm still in a sling. She spoke quietly and briefly. A stick is not a stick. A stick is a spear without a tip. A spear is an extension of the arm. The arm protects what is behind you. Behind you are rice and water and children and names on the wall. Learn. The women learned, clumsily, stumbling, dropping their sticks, but they learned. Because Ada didn't yell at them the way the male instructors in the militias did. She spoke softly. She demonstrated. She positioned their hands, corrected their stance, and every time someone made a movement correctly, she nodded, a single nod, without words, and that nod was worth more than any praise. Taemin watched from the edge of the terrace, so Rin sat nearby and wrote new words on the barn wall. Stance, lunge, block, retreat. She wrote everything down, all the words from all the worlds. Kangsul wasn't watching the training. She was counting the sacks in the barn and thinking that the harvest was 40 days away and that they needed 2 more barns. Hana stood by the hut and watched the swordswoman. Then she turned to Taemin and said that this woman was dangerous. Taemin asked why. Hana replied that it was because she looked at him the same way Sorin did. Only Sorin looked with admiration, while this one looked with judgment, as if deciding whether he was worthy of her dying for him. Taemin didn't know how to respond. In 10 days, 12 women knew how to stand in formation. Not to fight, to stand. Shoulder to shoulder, spears forward, step in unison. It's not much, but it's a wall. A living wall of 12 women who for the first time in their lives stood not behind men, but in front of them. Ada told Taemin that in a month they would be ready for real spears. Taemin said there were no spears. Ada replied that there was bamboo. Sharp bamboo cuts just as well as iron. You just need the right angle. Taemin looked at her. She spoke of the angle of the bamboo cut with the same calmness with which he spoke of the angle of the terrace's slope. Professionals, each in their own field. On the 91st day, the rice began to head. Taemin stood on the upper terrace and watched as the heavy ears of rice bent toward the water. The grains filled out day by day. Taemin checked every ear. He counted the grains. 62 on this one, 58 on that one, 65 on the third, above average, way above average. The land was working as it should after the beans, so Rin checked the leaves for disease. Clear. The ducks were finishing off the last caterpillars. The water stood still. Everything was going according to plan. For the first time in 90 days, everything was going according to plan. Kangsul was preparing the granaries, 2 new ones, bigger, with double bottoms and a gravel cushion. The women in her crew were building quickly. They'd learned. Hana was counting down the days until harvest. 20. Taemin stood on the terrace and listened to the ears of grain rustling in the wind. Beneath his feet, the earth hummed evenly and calmly, content, well rested, like a mother who had finally gotten a good night's sleep. He allowed himself to think that it might work out. Maybe he really would feed this valley. Maybe the rice would grow. Maybe the tribute would be paid. Maybe the girls wouldn't be taken away. Maybe. The boy at the bottom of his memory smiled. The harvest began on the 110th day. Before dawn, Taemin went out onto the upper terrace and plucked the first ear of rice. Heavy, full. The grains were white and dense. He clenched the ear in his palm and felt its weight. Not just a few grams. Life. Every grain is someone's bowl. Every bowl is someone's name. He placed the ear in the basket and began to work. Everyone came out. His mother, Hana, Kangsul, Sorin, Sunhee, 16 of those who had arrived last. The women from Kamsan who came every day to help. The elderly, the children. Even Che Ara had set aside her sword and joined the line. Her left hand was working. Her right hand wasn't quite there yet. But she cut the ears of grain with one hand faster than most could with two. Taemin showed them how to cut. Low, at the base of the stalk. The stalks would later be used for straw for the granaries and roofs. Don't throw anything away. Every part of the plant is a resource. Kang Sol stood by the granaries and received the baskets. She counted. She weighed them on a homemade scale made of a stick and 2 sacks of stones. She wrote it down. The first basket, the second, the 5th, the 10th. By noon, the upper terrace had been harvested. Kang Sol announced the result. Taemin stood nearby and listened to the number. Then he did the math in his head. The yield from the upper terrace was 3.5 times higher than the norm for the valley fields. So Rin looked at him and saw his hands trembling, not from fatigue, from what had been achieved. 20 years of knowledge from another world, 110 days of work on this, and now the rice is in the granary, white, dry, real. The harvest took 4 days, 7 terraces. Each yielded more than Taemin had expected. The soil worked better than he'd hoped after the beans. The ducks saved the crop from pests more than he'd anticipated. The water never failed. Kang Sol kept records with a precision that took Taemin's breath away. Every sack was numbered. Everyone was signed. Harvest date, terrace number, weight, name of the harvester. She did this without being asked, because this is her granary, and her granary is in order. By the evening of the 4th day, all the sacks were stacked in the 3 granaries. Kang Sol had counted them, the total. Taemin listened. Triple the tax, the one he had promised the collectors, covered, with a surplus, enough for the tax and to feed everyone until the next harvest. Everyone. 105 names on the birch bark. He sat down on the barn threshold and closed his eyes. His mother approached. She placed her hand on his head, heavy, warm, like in childhood. Not his childhood, the childhood of the shepherd boy, but the hand was the same, and the head was the same. A week later, the tax collectors arrived. The same 3 horsemen, the same scribe. The senior collector dismounted and looked at the village. He remembered it differently. Dry, dead, empty. Now the terraces on the slopes were green. People stood by the wells with buckets. Smoke rose from the huts. It smelled of cooked rice. Taemin met him at the barn. He bowed. He opened the door. The sacks stood in neat rows, white, labeled, numbered. The collector stepped inside. He touched a sack, untied it, scooped up a handful, looked at the grain, rubbed it between his fingers, sniffed it. His expression changed. He had seen a lot of rice over the years of his service. This was better than the rice from the capital, cleaner, larger, drier. The clerk counted the sacks. He counted for a long time. Then he named the number, triple the tax, as promised. The collector looked at Taemin, then at the terraces, then back at Taemin. He asked how. Taemin answered with a single word, work. The collector was silent. Then he nodded. The sacks were loaded onto 2 horses, and they left. Without the girls, without the women, without the slaves, with the rice. The village watched them go. Taemin stood by the granary and counted the remaining sacks. Enough. Enough until the next harvest. And there would still be some left for seeds. Kang Sol locked the granary. She hung a wooden bolt on the door. She ran her hand over her name on the doorframe, and for the first time in his presence, she smiled. Not widely, just the corners of her lips, but it was a smile. In the evening, by the hearth, her mother cooked rice, a lot of it, a full pot. Hana handed out bowls. Everyone ate. Mother, Hana, Sunhee, Kang Sol, Sorin, Ara, the 16 who had come, the elders, the neighbors, the children. They ate in silence, because when your mouth is full, you don't talk. Taemin ate and thought. 110 days, 1 well, 7 terraces, 5 wells, 3 granaries, 105 names, 1 harvest, the first, not the last. Tomorrow the 2nd season will begin. New terraces, new fields, new names, and in another week, the rumor of the triple tax from the dead valley will reach Governor An Dushik. And then another kind of work will begin, the kind you can't prepare for with a hoe. The rumor reached him faster than Taemin thought. 10 days after the harvest, a rider appeared at the pass, alone, without a spear, wearing an expensive robe with the insignia of the governor's office. He dismounted by the well. He looked around. He saw the terraces, the wells, the women working on the slope. He saw the rice on the lower terraces, already in its 2nd crop, and his face took on the look of a man who had seen something he didn't expect and didn't know whether to rejoice or fear. Taemin went out to meet him. He bowed. The horseman introduced himself as the clerk of Governor An Dushik. He said that the governor had heard about the unprecedented harvest in Tangok and wanted to understand how it was possible. Because Tangok had been written off, a dead valley, empty villages, and suddenly a triple tax yield, the governor wanted to see it with his own eyes. An inspection would arrive in 20 days. The clerk inspected the terraces. He wrote something down on a tablet. He tasted the water from the well. He looked at the granaries, at the door bearing the name Kang Sol, at the list of names that now took up 3 birch bark sheets and hung on the wall of Chon's hut. Then he rode off. Taemin stood by the road and watched him go. Hana approached from behind. She said it was beginning. Taemin nodded. It was beginning. 20 days to prepare. But prepare for what? Not for battle. Fighting the governor is suicide. Andushik has 40 spears and cavalry, and the right to execute without trial. Tangok has 12 women with bamboo sticks. Not for flight. There's nowhere to run. You can't carry away the terraces. You can't hide the wells. To what Taemin did best. To showing results. If the governor sees that Tangok feeds himself and pays his taxes on time, he has no formal reason to intervene. But Taemin knew that formalities weren't the main thing. The main thing was that Governor Andushik was a smart man, and a smart man wouldn't see the wells or the terraces. He would see a threat, a new way of ruling, power through food, not through fear. And he would realize that if this method spread, his own world would collapse. 20 days. Taemin worked harder than ever. He doubled the size of the terraces. He laid the foundation for a second set of wells for the lower villages. So Rin planted a herb garden on the northern slope. Medicinal plants, mint, wormwood, mountain saxifrage, wild ginger. She worked from dawn to dusk. Taemin diverted a separate stream from the mountain spring to her plot. He put up a fence of woven branches, and in the evening, when the plot was ready, he brought the elders to her. He said that everything growing here was under So Rin's care. Whoever wants medicine goes to So Rin, not to him. So Rin stood nearby and said nothing. The elders exchanged glances. One nodded, another, a third. She was accepted. Not aloud, not by ritual. With a nod, that was enough. That evening, So Rin went out to the plot. Hana later said she saw her lying face down in the grass for a long time. Taemin didn't go to her. He knew he shouldn't. Choeata trained the women every day. Now there were 24 of them. Bamboo spears with scorched tips, not toys, weapons. Ada made them run up and down the slope with spears at the ready. She lined them up. She had them turn around. She formed them into a wedge. 24 women moved as one body, not perfectly, but together. Taemin asked Ada why she was showing the inspection team armed women. It was a provocation. Ada replied that not showing them was a sign of weakness, and weakness provokes more than strength. Taemin thought about it and agreed. Kang Sol was preparing the granaries for inspection. She cleaned every corner. She counted every sack. She arranged them in order. She was preparing for the arrival of the inspection, just as she had prepared for the arrival of her mother-in-law in her past life, with cold thoroughness and hidden fury. On the 20th day, the inspection arrived. 40 soldiers with spears, 10 on horseback, and 2 unarmed men. One was an old man in the robe of a priest of the 6 ears of corn, with a staff entwined with ears of corn, with a white beard and sharp eyes. The other was a young man in an expensive robe with the sash of the governor's office. Andushik did not come himself. He sent people, a priest and an official, one to check for heresy, the other for treason. Taemin met them by the road, alone, unarmed, with a staff in his hand, his grandfather's, that very one. He bowed. He invited them in. He led them through the valley, slowly, as one leads guests. He showed them the wells. He let them taste the water. He showed them the terraces. He let them touch the earth. He showed them the second crop of rice, green, robust, even. He showed them the granaries. Kang Sol opened the doors and stood inside, straight as a spear. Sacks in rows, labeled, numbered. The official counted. The priest watched. Then Taemin led them to the table that Hana had set up by the hut. The table was groaning under the weight. Boiled rice, bean porridge, radish with salt, So Rin's herbal decoction, mushrooms that Sun He had gathered on the northern slope. The inspection team ate, for a long time, greedily, because the soldiers were hungry too. The capital fed the army barely enough to survive, but here the rice was white and the porridge thick. and they were given seconds without even asking. The priest ate and said nothing. Then he stood up. He walked over to the terrace. He knelt down. He took some soil. He sniffed it. He tasted it. Then he turned to Taemin. The old man's eyes were moist. He said that the soil here was blessed, that the 6 ears spoke through it, that the blood of the earth was not heresy, but mercy, and that he would announce this publicly before the chancellery and before the temple. Taemin bowed. The official remained silent. His face was inscrutable. He wrote down everything he saw, every number, every sack, every terrace. Then he rolled up the scroll and put it in his bag. He stood up. He bowed briefly. He turned to the soldiers, and he left. The priest lingered. He approached Taemin and spoke quietly, that the governor would not accept his word, that the governor needed not a blessed peasant, but an obedient one, that the priest would do what he could, but that Taemin should take care of himself. Taemin bowed and thanked him. The priest left with the detachment. The caravan set off for the pass. Taemin watched them go. Hannah stood beside him. She asked what he was thinking. Taemin replied that the priest would not reach the capital alive. Hannah looked at him. He said that the governor did not need a priest who called Tangok blessed. The governor needs a priest who calls Tangok cursed, but this priest called him blessed. In front of 40 witnesses, Hannah closed her eyes. 12 days later, news arrived. The priest was found dead on the way back. He had fallen from his horse at a mountain pass. His neck was broken. The horse returned to the barracks without a rider. No one investigated. Mountain roads are dangerous. Old men fall. Taemin sat by the hearth and said nothing. Sorin sat beside him. Hannah stood by the wall. Kong-sol stood in the barn doorway. Ara was sharpening her sword by the well. The quiet sound of steel against stone. Rhythmic. Steady. The war had begun. Quietly. Without a declaration. With the death of the old priest on the mountain road. Governor Andu Shik sent an inspection party of 40 soldiers, accompanied by a priest and an official. Taemin fed them and showed them the results. The priest publicly declared the blood of the earth a blessing. 12 days later, the priest was killed on the return journey. Taemin realized that the governor had gone to war. After the priest's death, people began arriving in Tangok, not one, by the dozens. Word of the valley where there was water and rice spread throughout the western part of Gyeonggan. Families from abandoned villages, lonely old men, women with children, men without arms, lost in the governor's war. In a month, Tangok's population had quadrupled. 400 people. Taemin wrote down every name. There wasn't enough birch bark left. Kong-sol suggested carving the names into the barn wall. Taemin nodded. Ada assigned 4 women from the guard to watch the road, day and night. 2 at the southern entrance to the valley, 2 at the northern. Bamboo spears, not for fighting, for warning, so that no one would enter unnoticed. Problems grew along with the people. There wasn't enough food. The terraces yielded plenty, but 400 mouths are not the same as 100. Taemin expanded the fields, new slopes, new springs, new wells. Sorin found 3 types of edible roots on the mountain slopes that the locals didn't know about. She showed the women how to gather and prepare them, bitter but nutritious, enough to tide them over between harvests. Taemin worked 18 hours a day. The shepherd's body had grown stronger over those months. His muscles had bulked up. His hands had become calloused, but his eyes were sunken and his cheekbones protruded because he gave his portion to those who arrived last. Kong-sol noticed. She began setting out a double bowl for him. He pushed the second one away. She pushed it back, silently, every evening. The same silent war by the hearth. Hana once said that if he died of starvation while saving the hungry, she would personally drag him out of his grave and beat him with a stick. Taemin ate the second bowl. In the 3rd month after the harvest, the governor struck the first blow, not a military one, a trade one. The salt caravans that used to pass through the valley to the southern villages stopped coming to Tangok. They took the mountain road instead, 3 times longer, but they bypassed it. The salt in Tangok ran out in a week. You can't store rice without salt. You can't salt radishes for the winter. You can't treat wounds. Sorin explained that some of her poultices don't work without salt. Taemin thought about it for 3 days. Then he took Sorin and went to the eastern edge of the valley, to where a rocky ledge sloped down into the ground at an angle. He remembered seeing a white coating on the rocks there. Sorin confirmed it, a mineral spring. Water passed through the salt layer and left a deposit on the surface. Taemin scraped off the deposit. He tasted it on his tongue. Bitter, but salty. Not table salt, mineral salt, with impurities. But if boiled down, if they collected the water from this spring in clay vats and evaporated it in the sun, salt would remain, coarse, gray, but salt. 10 days later, Taeho had his own salt works. 4 clay vats on flat stones. The water was evaporating. Gray crystals remained on the stup. Sorin tasted each batch and rejected those where there was too much bitterness. Consol distributed it. This much for salting, this much for storage, this much for Sorin for medicine. The governor cut off the salt. Taeho had his way. The second blow was more serious. Slave traders. 5 from the south. They came at night. They climbed over the goat pen. They were heading for Chan's hut, to his mother. Taking Taemin's mother meant taking away his leverage. You can bargain with leverage. They didn't make it. Ara heard them first. She was sleeping at the hut's threshold with a sword under her head, a habit from her days in the militia. She didn't wake anyone. She stepped out into the darkness, alone, with a sword. Taemin woke up to a scream. Not a scream of pain, a scream of terror. Someone else's. He ran outside. 2 slave traders lay by the pen. One was clutching his leg. The second wasn't moving. The third was on his knees with his hands above his head. Ara stood before him with a sword to his throat. Calm. Her breathing was steady. The other 2 had fled into the darkness. Taemin approached. He looked at the slave trader on his knees, young, with terrified eyes. He asked who had sent them. The slave trader remained silent. Ara pressed the sword against his throat. A drop of blood trickled down his neck. He spoke. He said a man from the capital had hired them. Not the governor. A merchant from the coast named Moon Chol. He didn't want Taemin. He wanted a method to find a man who could draw water from stone and sell it to the southern princes. His mother was the bait. To take his mother and wait until Taemin came himself. Taemin listened. Then he told Ara to put away her sword. Ara did so. The slave trader fell face down on the ground. Taemin told him to get up and leave, and to tell Moonchol that the method isn't for sale, because a method isn't a thing. A method is names, and names can't be stolen. The slave trader stood up and ran. The 2 wounded men crawled after him. Taemin stood in the darkness and breathed. His hands were shaking, not from fear, from anger. They had come for his mother, for the woman who cooks rice and keeps silent and knows that there are 2 people inside her son's body and loves them both. They wanted to take her away as if she were an object. Ara stood nearby, silently, wiping her sword with a rag. Then she said that 12 women weren't enough. 30 were needed. Taemin nodded. By morning, the whole village knew about the night attack. 18 women came to Ara and asked her to take them on as trainees. Ara took them all. The Taeho Women's Guard grew to 42 members in a single morning. Her mother sat by the hearth and said nothing. Sun-hee clung to her. Hana stood by the door, a wood-chopping axe in her hands, and a face that would make even slave traders step back. Kang-sol counted the sacks in the granary. Everything was in place. Nothing had been touched. She closed the door and hung a new bolt, heavier than the old one. Taemin sat on a rock by the well and watched the dawn. The valley was waking up. Smoke rose from the huts. Women were walking toward the terraces. Children were running to the well. 400 people were starting a new day, and every one of them now knew what was worth fighting for that day. The population of Taeho had grown to 400. The governor had cut off the salt supply, but Taemin had found a mineral spring and set up his own salt works. That night, slave traders tried to kidnap Taemin's mother, but Che Ara stopped them. The women's guard had grown to 42. The year ended with snow, the first in 3 years. Taemin stood in the doorway of the hut and watched as white flakes settled on the terraces. Snow meant water. In the spring, it would melt and nourish the earth. The drought was breaking, slowly, but it was breaking. Over the course of a year, Taeho had changed beyond recognition. 12 villages, 8,000 inhabitants. People kept coming and coming, from the valleys, from the coast, from beneath the walls of the capital. Fugitive peasants, homeless artisans, widows, orphans. Everyone gave a name. Every name was carved into the wall. The wall of the first granary was finished. They started on the second, then the third. Taemin couldn't keep up with the building, but a team had grown up around him. Kang Sol managed 3 grain silos with double bottoms and kept track of every sack in the valley. So Rin treated people and trained 4 girls she had selected herself. Choyara commanded a 200-strong spear guard. Hana ran the household and served as Taemin's second voice in all the arguments he walked away from because he didn't like to shout. Hana loved to shout, and she did it well. Taemin expanded the network of canals, underground ground, lined with stone. So Rin found clay that, once fired, was watertight. Taemin showed them how to make pipes, short, thick, with a flared end on one side. One pipe was inserted into another. The joints were sealed with the same clay. Underground, at a depth of 1.5 chok, water flowed from mountain springs to the terraces and from the terraces to the villages, with no loss to evaporation, without mud, no disruptions. Hedy drew up plans for the canals. She arrived at the beginning of winter, small, noisy, with fingers smudged with coal and 3 pigtails. She was 16. Her father, a surveyor, had died of a fever on the road a month ago. She walked alone with his scrolls on her back. The scrolls were maps, old ones, detailed ones, with elevation marks and riverbeds. Taemin unrolled the first scroll and measured it, a map of western Kimgan, with a precision he hadn't expected from this world. Hedy stood beside him and talked non-stop, about how her father taught her to draw, about how she could do columnar addition faster than any scribe, about how she could calculate a mountain's height from 3 points on the ground. Taemin listened and realized he was looking at an engineer, without formal education, without schooling, but with a gift for space and numbers that cannot be learned. He asked her to draw a map of Tangok, the entire valley, with terraces and wells and canals. Hedy worked for 3 days. She didn't eat. She didn't sleep. Sorin forced her to drink and eat with threats. Hana forced her to sleep by shouting. Hedy heard neither one nor though. On the 4th day, she brought the scroll to Taemin. He unrolled it on the table and saw his valley. All of it. Every terrace, every well, every ditch, every granary, every house. With numbers, with distances, with elevation marks. The map was beautiful. Not as decoration, as truth. Taemin looked at it and saw for the first time what he had built. Not in pieces, in its entirety. And in its entirety, it looked like a system. Alive, functioning, connected by water and earth and names. He told Hedy he would hang the map in the barn, on the most prominent wall, with her name on it. Not his, hers. Hedy blushed to her ears. Then she straightened up. Then she said she needed better quality charcoal and rice straw paper, which she had decided to make herself. Taemin wrote her name on birch bark. Hedy adored him openly and without restraint. She followed him around everywhere. She asked questions that made Sorin roll her eyes and Hana snort. What is a percentage? What is scale? What is a horizontal line? Taemin answered every one, seriously, as an equal. Hedy wrote down the answers in the margins of her maps, in small, angular handwriting. Once, Sorin saw these notes and said that she had run out of space on the barn wall. Could she write new words in the margins of Heidi's maps? Hedy replied that she could, if Sorin stopped calling her a child. Sorin stopped. From then on, Heidi's cards were filled with 2 handwritings, angular like an engineer's, and round like a herbalist's. 2 languages of knowledge on a single sheet of paper. Taemin looked at it and thought, this is it. This is what the beginning looks like. Not of an academy, not a university, just the beginning of that moment when people record knowledge not for themselves, but for those who will come after. Before he died, Heidi's father told her she was too smart, and that for a woman, that was a curse. Hedy believed it. She carried it inside her like a stone. Taemin didn't know about this until Hana told him. Hana told him because Hedy cried at night, thinking no one could hear her. Hana heard everything. Taemin didn't talk to Hedy about it. He did something else. When the map was hung in the House of Names, he summoned the elders, 12 men from 12 villages. He stood before the map and said that this was a map of their valley, that canals, terraces, and wells had been built according to this map, that without this map, nothing they saw around them would exist, and that this map had been made by Yoon Hedi. He pointed to the name in the corner of the scroll, large, black. Hedi stood by the wall and chewing on the tip of a piece of charcoal. The 12 elders looked at the map, then at the name, then at the girl with soot-stained fingers, and one by one, they nodded. Hedi stopped chewing on the charcoal, she straightened her back, and she never cried at night again. Pae Min-soo was the last to arrive, quiet, pale, with a straight back and eyes filled with hatred, the daughter of the murdered priest. She had learned how her father had died, not from a fall from a horse, from a blow to the back of the head, the governor's men. She had come to Tangok not because she believed in Taemin. She came because Taemin was the only person in Gyeonggang whom Governor An Du-shik feared, and Min-soo wanted to be close to the one whom her father's killer feared. Taemin accepted her, not because he needed a priestess, because he saw before him a person who had had everything taken from her and who had not broken. She knew 3 languages. She knew the sacred texts. She knew court etiquette and diplomatic protocol. She knew how to speak to ambassadors and officials in a language they understood. Taemin told her that Tangok needed a voice. Not his voice. His voice was that of a shepherd, rustic, simple. Tanggoku needed a voice that sounded like the capital. Min-soo was silent. Then she said she would be that voice. But on one condition. Taemin would build the temple of the 6 ears of corn in the valley, and her father's name would be carved above the entrance, first, before the king's name. Taemin nodded. The temple took 20 days to build. The women of the guard carried the stone. The men from Kamsan erected the walls. The roof was thatched with straw from the terraces. Small, sturdy, with a single room and an altar of smooth stone. Above the entrance, Taemin carved 3 characters. The priest's name, first, before all the others. Min-soo came at night, alone. She stood at the entrance until dawn. Ara watched from the darkness, not out of distrust, out of concern, because people who stand alone at graves in the dark sometimes don't want to live to see the morning. Min-soo lived to see it. In the morning she went to Taemin. Her eyes were dry, her back was straight. She said she was ready. That evening, Min-soo and Taemin sat by the hearth. The others were asleep. Min-soo spoke first. She asked if he regretted what had happened, that her father had taken his side and died. Taemin was silent. Then he replied that he regretted it every day, that her father's name was the first one he carved not on birch bark but on stone, because stone doesn't rot or burn. Min-soo listened. Then she asked who he really was. Not a shepherd, she can see that. Taemin thought, for a long time. Then he told the truth, that he was an agronomist, from a place not marked on the maps of Haiti, from a world where light burns without fire and carts travel without horses, that he had drowned in a canal and woke up in the body of a shepherd, that the shepherd boy hadn't died, that the 2 of them were in one body. Min-soo listened just as she had once listened to sacred texts, with attention, with seriousness, without fear. Then she said that in the texts of the 6 ears of corn there is a line about a man from beyond the sky who will come when the earth forgets how to feed and will remind it. Taemin said he wasn't a prophet. She replied that prophets speak that way too. He didn't know what to say. She almost smiled. Almost. From then on, they talked in the evenings about the morality of his decisions, about whether it was fair to feed some at the expense of others, about whether one person had the right to decide who to accept and who to send away. Min-soo was the only one who argued with him openly. She didn't shout like Hana. She didn't stay silent like Ada. She argued, quietly, with arguments, with quotes from texts he hadn't read. Taemin listened and often changed his decisions after these conversations, not because she was right, because she made him think twice. Now there were 7 of them. Him, Kang-sol, Sorin, Cheara, Hana, Yoon Hedi, Bae Min-soo. 7 people, and 8,000 names on the wall. And beyond the pass, Governor An Du-shik was not sleeping either. He sat in his office reading reports. The Tangok Valley, 12 villages, 8,000 residents, taxes paid 4-fold, a women's guard of 200 spears, underground canals, their own salt works, their own temple, and a man named Jong Tae-min, whom the peasants call the Master of Grain. Sik set the scroll aside. He rubbed his eyes. He was a smart man. He understood that he was not facing a rebel. He had seen rebels and crushed them. What stood before him was something new. A man who does not seize power. He cultivates it, like rice. And with each passing day, his power takes root deeper, into the earth, into the water, into the people, into their very names. Sik tried to buy him off. He sent a messenger with an offer of a position and land. Taemin refused, through Minsu, politely, with ceremony, but he refused. Sik tried to break him, block the trade routes, salt, iron, cloth. Tangok found salt in his own rocks. He replaced iron with bamboo and burnt stone. He wove cloth from hemp that So-Rin found on the eastern slope. Sik tried to replicate it. He sent his men to neighboring valleys to dig wells modeled after Tangok's. The wells yielded no water, because the governor's men dug at random, without knowledge, without feeling, without names. 3 attempts, 3 failures. Sik sat in the darkness and thought, and for the first time in 50 years of life, he didn't know what to do. Within a year, Tangok had grown to 12 villages and 8,000 inhabitants. Cartographer Yoon Haedi and the daughter of the murdered priest, Bae Min-soo, joined the team. Haedi created a complete map of the valley and was recognized by the elders. Min-soo became Tangok's diplomatic voice and the only one who openly argued with Taemin. Governor Sik tried 3 times to buy, break, and replicate Tangok's success. He lost all 3 times. The second year began with Taemin blocking the grain caravans to the capital. Not permanently, for 40 days. It was the harshest decision he had ever made. Min-soo argued with him for 3 evenings in a row. She said it was war, that the capital would starve, that innocent people would die. Taemin listened. Then he replied that Tangok had been feeding the people in the capital, for free. The supply had been coming in regularly, 4 times the normal amount, and in response, the governor killed priests, sent slave traders, and cut off the salt supply. 40 days without grain isn't a war, it's a question, a simple question. Which is more important, the governor's power or rice in the bowls of the capital's residents? Min-soo fell silent. Then she said he was right, but that didn't make her feel any better. Taemin nodded and said he felt the same. Kang-sol closed the granaries. That was it. To the caravan drivers who came for grain, she said one word, no, and she closed the door. Ara posted guards at the mountain passes, not for battle, for control. Not a single sack was to leave the valley without Taemin's word. The capital sensed it on the 10th day. On the 20th, it grew restless. On the 30th, it began to starve. On the 35th day, King Haedon uttered the name Jung Taemin for the first time. Not in anger, in bewilderment. He asked his advisors who this man was. The advisors did not know. Governor Sik knew, but he remained silent, because explaining to the king that a single shepherd from the Dead Valley was feeding 1/3 of the capital meant admitting that the governor himself had been unable to manage it for 3 years. On the 40th day, Taemin opened the caravans. Grain flowed into the capital. The capital breathed a sigh of relief, but the question had been asked, and everyone heard the answer. Tangok feeds. Tangok may stop feeding. This is not a threat, it is a fact. The second year was spent working. Taemin connected Tangok to 2 neighboring valleys via underground canals. The population grew, 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. By the fall of the second year, 80,000. Harry drew maps non-stop, every new canal, every new terrace, every new village. Her rice straw paper turned out to be stronger than birch bark and softer than silk. So Rin trained 8 herbalists. Each received her own plot, with her name on the fence. So Rin walked among them and checked, corrected, taught. She was no longer a lonely half-breed with a bag of herbs. She was a master. People came to her. They studied under her. Ara had expanded the guard to 1,000 spears. The women trained every day, at dawn, running up the slope, formation, turn, strike, retreat. Ada stood before them and did not shout. She spoke quietly, and 1,000 women listened as one. Once, Taemin asked Ada for a favor. He led her to a small terrace on the eastern slope, a separate one, not connected to the main system. He gave her a handful of rice seeds, asked her to plant them, with her own hands, for one family, the one she had saved from raiders a month ago. A husband, a wife, 3 children. Ada looked at the seeds. She looked at the terrace. She looked at Taemin. Then she took off her sword. She laid it on a rock. She knelt down in the water, and she began to plant, seed by seed, Fingers that had held a sword for 12 years delved into the wet earth cautiously, hesitantly, as if the earth might break at the slightest touch. Taemin stood nearby and did not help. It was her field, her hands, her first creation. A month later, green shoots rose from the furrows. Ada came to the terrace alone. She sat on the edge of the terrace and watched them for an hour, without moving. Taemin knew because Sorin told him. Sorin knew because Harry drew it. Harry drew it because she was standing on the slope above and couldn't help herself. The drawing was simple. A woman with a sword on a rock sits by the water and looks at the rice. Taemin asked for the drawing. Harry gave it to him. He hung it in the House of Names, next to the map of the valley. He didn't sign it. Ada saw it. She said nothing. But that evening she stood at the threshold of the hut and stood there for a long time. Then she walked off into the darkness. Then she returned, her eyes dry, her back straight, as always. In its third year, Tanggok became what Taemin had envisioned from day one. Not a village, not a city, not a fortress, a system. 300,000 people, 12 villages, a network of underground canals 3 days' journey long, terraces on both slopes of the valley and on the slopes of 2 neighboring ones. A women's guard of 3,000 spears, its own saltworks, its own paper, its own herbal medicine, and the House of Names, a long stone granary for 300,000 names. Taemin opened it at the beginning of the 3rd year. Kang Sol suggested the idea, not just a wall with names, a granary with names, each name next to a shelf. On the shelf, a sack, labeled, with grain that belongs to that name. 300,000 sacks, 300,000 names. Every person in the valley knows they have a sack, with their name on it, in a house that no one can take away. Taemin stood in the House of Names and looked at the walls, and he realized that this was no longer a list. It was a constitution, written not with words, but with names. The law is simple. Everyone has a name. Every name has rice. Whoever feeds the people rules. Not the one with soldiers, not the one with a family tree. The one whose granary holds the name of everyone who eats from it. Merchants from the capital began to come on their own, without the governor's order, without permission, because Tanggok fed the capital, and the capital wanted to eat. Caravans traveled under the merchant's own protection, because without Tanggok's grain, the capital would not have survived until spring. Governor An Dushik understood he had lost, but he couldn't stop, because stopping meant admitting defeat, and admitting defeat meant losing everything. He sent a final detachment, 100 spears, not to Tanggok, to the neighboring valley, to burn the crops, to destroy the canals, to show what happens to those who feed not from the governor's hand, but from the shepherd's. Ada found out the next day. Her lookouts at the passes had seen the column. She went to Taemin. She said that 100 soldiers were heading east, toward the fields he'd been building for 6 months. Taemin stood on the roof of the granary. He looked out over the valley. He thought. Then he came down. He gathered his people, Kang Sol, Sorin, Ara, Hana, Hyeri, Minsu. The 7 of them at the table. He said he wouldn't fight. Ara raised an eyebrow. He explained, 100 soldiers will burn the fields in the eastern valley. It hurts. It's a loss. But the fields can be replanted. And if the guard takes the field against the governor's soldiers, that's no longer defense. It's rebellion. And then it won't be 100 soldiers who come, but 1,000. And not with spears, but with the king's order. Minsu nodded. She understood. Ara didn't nod. She didn't understand why they should endure when they could win. Taemin looked at her. He said that winning isn't about killing. Winning is about making the enemy unnecessary. Ara was silent. Then she asked what he was proposing. Taemin proposed a simple thing. Instead of a battle, he would send a caravan to the soldiers, with food, rice, porridge, radishes, salted mushrooms, hot sodium herbal tea, 100 bowls for 100 soldiers. Kang Sol counted in her head and nodded. That's enough. Sodin asked why. Taemin answered, the governor's soldiers are hungry. The capital feeds them barely enough to survive. They're going to burn the fields because they received an order. But if you put a bowl of hot rice in front of them and say it's from Tanggok, for free, with each soldier's name on it, then they'll have to choose, burn the fields of the man who fed them, or take the bowl. Hana snorted and said he was mad. Then she stood up and went to cook rice for 100 people. The caravan met the soldiers on the approach to the eastern valley. 10 women from the guard, without spears, carrying baskets. Minsu walked ahead in a white priestess's robe. She stopped in front of the squad commander. She bowed. She said that Tanggok greeted the warriors of Hedon and asked them to share their food with her before the journey. The commander looked at her, then at the baskets, then at his soldiers. The soldiers looked at the baskets. They hadn't eaten a hot meal in 3 days. The commander hesitated. Minsu opened the first basket. The scent of steamed rice wafted through the air. White steam, thick, warm. The commander sat down. The soldiers sat down. They ate in silence, greedily. Minsu stood and waited. When the last bowl was empty, she asked the commander if he knew why he had come. The commander did not answer. She said that behind him were the fields that fed his family in the capital, that if he burned them, his wife and children would go hungry in the winter, that the grain he had just eaten was the same grain that went to the capital every month. The commander remained silent. Then he stood up. He lined up the soldiers, he turned them around, and he left, without a single stalk burned. Ondusik received the report that evening. The soldiers returned. The fields were intact. 100 bowls of rice. He sat in the darkness, and for the first time in 50 years of life, he realized he had lost. Not a battle, not a war, a game, because this shepherd was playing a different game, one where the winner is not the one who kills, but the one who feeds. Winter of the 3rd year. Snow lay on the terraces like a white blanket. A royal embassy approached Tangok. Not an army, 20 officials bearing gifts, with silk and silver and a sandalwood chest. The king wanted Taemin to become the keeper of Hedon's grain, the second in command of the state. The envoys stood at the entrance to the valley and froze, because no one had invited them in. Ara lined up a guard on both sides of the road, 3,000 spears, silent, steady, faces unmoving, shoulder to shoulder. Above them the banner of Tangok rose for the first time. Not a dragon, not a tiger, an ear of grain with 3 kernels, representing the first 3 saved, mother, sister, widow. The envoys walked between 2 walls of silent women and were paler than the snow on the terraces. Minsu met them in the square in front of the House of Names, in a white robe, with her back straight, with a voice that sounded like the capital. She spoke to them in the court language, with ceremonies and titles and formulas that no one in Tangok knew except her. The envoys entered the House of Names. Taemin was waiting inside, alone, by the far wall, with his grandfather's staff in his hand. He watched as the envoys stopped at the entrance and raised their eyes to the walls. Names. From floor to ceiling, from the entrance to the far wall. 300,000. He gave them time. Then he led them along the wall, slowly, in complete silence. 2 hours. Past the names from Tangok, past the names from Kamsan, past the names of the 16 refugees, past the names from all 12 villages, past the names from the 3 neighboring valleys. One of the envoys stopped by the wall and touched a name with his finger, roughly carved, crooked, by a child's hand. A child who carved his own name because he wanted to be on the wall like the adults. The envoy pulled his hand back, as if the wall were hot. At the far wall, Taemin stopped. He turned to the envoys and said, "Tell the king, he will not go to the capital. But if the king is hungry, let him send his name. He will inscribe it on the wall, and then the king will have rice." The senior envoy opened his mouth, closed it. He had been preparing for negotiations, for bargaining, for threats. Not for this. Not for a wall with 300,000 names and a shepherd who offers the king the chance to become one of them. Minsu stood nearby and translated into courtly language. She softened the form. She preserved the essence. The ambassadors bowed, lower than one bows to an equal, and they left. The Khan was waiting outside with tea and flatbreads, because guests are fed even if they are uninvited. That is the law of the house. The ambassadors ate. They mounted their horses. They rode away through a line of 3,000 silent women with spears. Taemin stood in the doorway of the House of Names and watched them go. Kang Sol approached and stood to his left. Hana stood to his right. Behind them were So-rin, Ada, Hairi, and Minsu. 7 of them. Snow was falling, quietly, steadily. Kang Sol said that the granaries were in order and that there would be enough for the winter. In that voice, quiet, steady, which meant that everything was in its place. Hana said dinner was ready, and that if he gave away his portion again, she would shove the bowl into his hands herself. So-rin said she would double the size of the plot in the spring. Ara stood slightly to the side, hand on her sword, eyes on the road. Harry was drawing. She sat on a rock and sketched the view from above. The guard formation, torches, snow. Minsu stood by the temple. She looked at her father's name above the entrance. Then she turned and walked toward the others. Taemin entered the House of Names, alone. 300,000 small lamps burned along the walls, one for each name. The flames flickered in the draught. He walked along the wall, slowly, tracing the names with his fingers. The first ones: Mother, Sun-hee, Kang-sol, Oh-jin-ai, So-rin, Tok. Then dozens, then hundreds, then thousands. Each name is a night on the terrace, a handful of earth on the tongue, a well in the rock, a sack of rice, a bowl of porridge covered with a rag. He reached the far wall. There was an empty space there, a small one, for a single name. He took out a knife, the same one he'd used 3 years ago to carve Kang Sol's name on the barn door, and he carved it. Jong Tae-min, not his own, a boy, a shepherd, the one who slept at the bottom of memory, the one whose blood carried a gift for 3 generations, the one his mother loved first, the one who smiled in his sleep every time the earth fed a new person. Taemin pressed his palm against the wall. The stone was warm. The earth beneath the House of Names hummed, quietly, contentedly, like a mother who hears that all her children are home. At the bottom of memory, the boy woke up. Not fully, for a second. He looked through Taemin's eyes at the wall, at the lights, at the snow outside the door, and he had a single thought, pure, simple, like water from the first well. Good. Then he fell asleep, smiling. Taemin put away the knife, stepped out onto the porch. It was snowing. Kang Sol was waiting by the hearth, 2 bowls, both for him. He sat down, took one, ate slowly. The rice was hot, plain, real. Behind the wall, Hana was scolding Sun-hee for running away without a gold. So-rin was writing something on the barn wall by lamplight. Ara stood by the gate. Hedy slept with her face buried in her own drawing. Minsu was reading aloud by the temple. His mother slept, soundly for the first time in 3 years, because everyone was home. Taemin finished his rice. He set down the bowls. He looked at Kang Sol. She was sitting across from him, mending clothes. She wasn't looking at him, but the corners of her lips twitched. She knew he was watching. Taemin stepped out onto the threshold. He stood there. He looked. 300,000 lights in the House of Names. Snow on the terraces. Silence. A single thought. The same one as on the first day, when he lay face down in the grass with dirt in his mouth and a goat chewing on his sleeve. Clear, cold, like the water beneath his feet. The first winter they had all survived. That meant they had a job. That meant they had done it. Taemin had blocked the grain caravans for 40 days and forced the capital to realize its dependence on Tangok. Ada had planted rice with her own hands for the first time in her life. The governor sent 100 soldiers to burn the fields, but Taemin fed them, and they left. A royal embassy arrived with an offer to make Taemin the second in command of the state. He refused and asked the king to send his name for the wall. He carved the name of the shepherd boy into the House of Names. The boy at the bottom of memory woke up for a second and thought of one word. Good. All 7 were together. The valley lived. It snowed all night.